Chapter 1531. It was like a gentle breeze that blew through the valley, causing the forest to rustle. Brando stepped through a bush and stopped at the top of the mountain, looking at the familiar valley. The low valley was where the Lord of the Thorny Chain died. The disciples of the Black Flames chased after them up the mountain. He turned back to look at Scarlet. The red-haired girl was staring blankly at the valley in the distance. Perhaps because she noticed Brendel's gaze, she turned back. Their eyes met, and the girl's eyes were filled with gentleness. After reopening the old scars, the Highlander girl's heart was at peace. She was no longer standing in the past, and the scar in her heart was gradually disappearing. I remember. This is where we met. Yes, my lord. So many years have passed in the blink of an eye. Medisa smiled as she looked at the two of them. It's a pity that Mr. Eek and Miss Yura fell together with that person in the chaos. If only they could be here today and see the beautiful scenery of the Chablis Mountains year after year. How good would that be? Brando sighed. It's a pity that we were a step too late. I still don't know how to tell Huang Hua. She said that she wanted to come to Erewhon to see her sister. There are always many things in this world that cannot be fulfilled, my lord, Medisa replied. My sister and I have met, but to be able to forgive each other at the last moment is enough for me to feel satisfied, because it is always better than missing out forever, isn't it? I think Mr. Eek is the same. At least he saw the future of Erewhon, and he believes that you won't disappoint him. Brando nodded. He felt a little emotional because Medisha was always so optimistic. Even the slightest touch could satisfy her small happiness. This fairy princess understood the meaning of beauty better than many human nobles. She silently held on to hope and brought happiness to others. My lord, was it in that valley that day? The elven princess, whose figure had become tall and slender in the past 2 to 3 years, had curled her beautiful silver hair. She pointed in a direction with her fair fingertips and asked. Brando and Scarlet looked in that direction and Brando nodded. Yes. Medisha giggled. At that time my lord and I were enemies. Brando also smiled. We were really scared out of our wits back then. Ferlin and her sister must have told you a lot about what happened back then. I know they like to talk about my embarrassing moments, but if it weren't for them, I wouldn't have been able to deal with you. The princess of the Silver Elves is merciless when facing her enemies. Medisa covered her mouth and chuckled. Scarlet also felt a little amused and couldn't help but ask about the situation back then. She had met Brendel after Medisa, and it was on that night that she suffered a fatal betrayal. The Kabai's blood in her body seemed to be restless, and this was the place where it was awakening. But the power of the golden apple surged and calmed the power of the divine blood. At that time his lordship accidentally killed me. Medisa explained the events of that night in a gentle tone. Even though she knew that the matter was resolved, the Highlander girl could not help but let out a low cry. And then? She asked. Even though he knew that I was an enemy, my lord still resurrected me. My lord has always been soft-hearted. That's only for girls. Medisha smiled slyly. If you don't believe me, you can ask Miss Delphian. Brendel was about to take out his water skin when he heard the words. Why are you talking about her again? Because after all, Miss Delphine is the woman closest to the Lord, but she was clearly the same as Miss Medisa previously, and had a hostile relationship with us. Are you saying that my lord doesn't have any responsibility for what happened in the Nine Phoenix? I'm not blaming anyone, but I hope that my lord can be more concerned about his own safety. Scarlet lowered her head and said with a hint of jealousy. Brando's face turned red. That's not the same thing. Ha ha ha, Scarlet giggled. After all, Miss Roman also said that my lord can't walk away when he sees a beautiful girl. Brando, who was drinking from his water skin, almost choked. He coughed violently and turned his head to look at Scarlet in disbelief. Did she really say that? Of course. From Fortress Reden to Bragg's, from Bragg's to Chablis, and from Chablis to Abies, Miss Freya is one, Miss Sue, Miss Amandina is another, Scarlet is another, Yuta is another, and Sifrit is another. It's inevitable that Miss Roman is unhappy, isn't it? After all, she's your real girlfriend. What are you talking about? Miss Sue is only the daughter of the Reto, and what does Miss Yuta have to do with me? Brando could not help but retort. Not to mention Sifrit, how old is she? What the hell are you thinking about? Medisha laughed happily. So my lord doesn't deny that he has other thoughts about Miss Amandina, Miss Freya, Scarlet, and me?" The Highlander girl gasped in surprise and quickly stole a glance at Brando. Brando opened his mouth, but no words came out. "I should have known that this little princess is actually black from the start." The valley was filled with the scenery of midsummer. Blooming lilies and ginkgo leaves adorned the Holy Land in the forest. The majestic temple surrounded by greenery had changed with the passage of time, and there was a sense of emptiness. Simple and unadorned wisteria climbed up the outer wall that had been in disrepair for a long time, and layers of leaves were smeared with a layer of emerald green. Brendel looked at the empty holy cathedral with some disappointment. Although he could not help but have some expectations in his heart, he also understood that the kind farewell was probably just a beautiful nostalgia. "It's been a long time, my friend. Remember to come back here and tell me what happened outside. A few decades or even 100 years is fine, but don't go back on your words, my friend." The ancient voice still echoed in the forest and did not fade away. A few decades, 100 years, how long was that? It was almost half of a mortal's life. When he grew old, would he still remember the beautiful promise he made in the mountains of Chablis? Brando lowered his eyelids and felt a little heartache. Perhaps the past would never come back. 100 years later, this place would only be a quiet ruin, and he would no longer exist in this world. A friendship would silently disappear here. If possible, Brando did not want to return to this place. He would rather leave this world with a trace of luck than face this silent reality. Therefore, he raised his head and looked at the bastard standing outside the holy sanctum with some dissatisfaction. It was his subordinate who had just returned from the Silver Bay area. The Shire smiled as he looked at Brando and the other two who were walking over. He was obviously waiting for them, and he said with a frivolous tone, "It's been a long time, my lord. It seems like you have already taken care of our two beauties." "Shut up, no one thinks you're a mute." Brendel glared at him. "Shut up, no one thinks you're a mute." Seal could not help but laugh out loud. He laughed so hard that tears rolled down his cheeks. Brendel finally understood that this bastard had been using magic to eavesdrop on his conversation with Med-Isa, and that question was done on purpose. "Speak," Brendel gritted his teeth. "Why did you ask us to come here?" "It's a small matter." The Shire stopped laughing and said seriously, "It's also to allow my lord to meet someone." "Meet someone?" Brando felt his heart skip a beat. He heard the rustling of footsteps as if they were walking on grass, and he turned around in disbelief. A tall and handsome elf stood there and looked at them with a smile. The elf had a reserved demeanor unique to the Silver Tribe and spoke to Brando in a soft voice. "It's been a long time, my friend." It was a simple greeting, but it gave Brendel the illusion that everything had changed. Yes, it's been a long time. The last time he was here, he was still clueless about Erwin's future. He could only rely on his foresight in the dark to find a chance. The tiny hope he had built in Ferber, the spark he had ignited in the loop of trade winds, the numerous battles he had gone through, and finally Ampere Seal had turned the tide. After everything he had done, he had finally reached this day. Everything had changed. The first time they met, it seemed like it was only yesterday. "It's been a long time." Brando said this after only 5 years, but when he said this, he had the illusion that he was relieved of a burden. "I didn't go back on my word, my friend." The wind started to blow in the valley, and it was a little windy today. For the Fireclaw Lizardman Lord Ropar, the scene in his memory had long disappeared. His former hometown had turned into pieces of broken land floating in the void. The flame in the center of the world was no longer burning fiercely, and it was constantly radiating golden light in all directions. The scorching river had become deathly still, and the lava was no longer flowing. The fiery temperature was slowly extinguished, and the lava had turned into scorched black and cold rocks. The elements seemed to have lost their home, and wandered in the vast space at a loss. The fairy prince Lute also looked at this scene, and he said softly, "The fire is extinguished. Our world has fallen into darkness. But one day, it will ignite again." Ropar nodded. The two of them carefully moved a huge rock away from the center of the magma river that led to the underground world. That place was originally the core of the entire world of the River of Scorching Heat, the source of all rivers. A fire seed that emitted endless light and heat used to burn here like the sun. But now there was only darkness left in the vast space. Soft footsteps stepped on the shattered stones as the two slowly moved forward in the hall, until they stopped in front of an altar. On the scorched altar, on the surface as smooth as a mirror, there was a black crystal inserted. In the very center of the crystal, there seemed to be a dark red spot of light. Fire seed. Ropar described this word in a somewhat sacred tone. In the Fireclaw Lizardman language, fire itself meant sacred. The manifestation of the law of Tiamat, the source of the mortal fire, that is the law power of a planeswalker. The little fairy Lute sat on his broad shoulders and answered seriously, the supreme inheritance of the fire elemental world. Although it has been extinguished, we can definitely ignite it again. The Fireclaw Lizardman Lord nodded. He took a step forward and grabbed the crystal, and a golden flame shot out from the lizardman's prismatic pupils. The card deck was called Scorching Fury. The ground shook slightly. Even Fayez and Malurcha, who were far away in the shallow sea, noticed the abnormality in the fire elemental world. The woman and the deer looked up at the same time, gazing into the distance. Although there were no longer waves in the shallow sea, and the water of the world flowed from all directions into the void on the cracked land, the distant silver and floating clouds were like the sea. The beauty of the shallow sea was still not inferior to any place in this world. The elements shook, and the four elemental worlds resonated with each other, as if it was the cry of a new life. For the first time since the fall of the Black Moon, after losing the law of Tiamat, all things and elements in the elemental border regained their vitality for the first time. Do you see it, Malurcha? Fayez cried out in surprise. It is reviving, the shallow sea is regaining its vitality. It will be a long process. Perhaps we will all turn into ashes in the torrent of time, and it will not return to the way it was in the past, Malurcha replied calmly. But there is still hope, isn't there? Malurcha nodded. Let's go, Malurcha, Fayez said in high spirits. It's all thanks to his lordship's shallow sea holy sword. After receiving the shallow sea inheritance, we can help him even more. But Malurcha did not move forward. Fayez sensed her companion's abnormality and looked at him strangely. What is it? The crystal stag stared blankly into the distance. In the cracks on the seawall, a tiny flower was swaying in the wind. It was a scaly stem, a raceme, and two flowers of stars on one stalk, guarding each other in the breeze. It was a scene it had seen many years ago. A tear slid down from the corner of the stag's eye. Riding on Malurcha's horn, Fayez was stunned for a moment. She said in an incredulous tone, "What?" In disbelief she said, That is Miss Tada's flower of stars." It was as if the endless war had ended. When the huge spatial anomaly slowly closed under the attack of the Buga's spells, everyone threw down the weapons in their hands and stood for a long time in front of the broken walls of Rushta. The Cruz people had lost the land of their ancestors here, and today they had returned here. Valhalla's towering treetops shone on the battlefield. The light spirits were signaling to everyone. It was estimated that in 10 hours, the fortress would begin to teleport again, and this time its destination would be back to Erewhon. The people of Erewhon were celebrating and cheering, because after a long war, the warriors could finally return to their homeland. Although there might be more dangerous situations to deal with, everyone was anxious to return home. For nearly 3 years, they had not seen their parents, wives, and children for a long time. The nostalgia for their loved ones and families had surpassed all strong feelings. Of course, they also had to bring back their compatriots who had died on the battlefield to their homeland, so that their souls could return to their homeland. When Tanajal's fleet also gathered in the sky, the other two fleets, the Cruz and Hazel fleets, turned in unison and saluted the warriors from the kingdom of Erewhon with their flags. This was a respect and gratitude that did not need to be described with words. An ancient civilization was reborn in the hands of mortals. In Valhalla, Hippamera sat on the bench with joy and focused on the thing in front of her. A hexagonal metal like some kind of shell. She was a little reluctant to put it down because this metal was specially made for her by the Holy Cathedral of Fire in recognition of her great contribution in this war after consulting her own opinion. It was probably the only alien metal in this war. Veronica looked at the girl a little strangely and asked Freya with her eyes, "She really likes this thing so much?" Well, Freya of course knew the strange hobby of the priestess of the majestic mountain goddess. It was said that the priestess of Himalaya had a more or less different aesthetic than ordinary people. They like those thick and solid things such as mountain rocks. In response to Veronica's question, she could only nod helplessly. Anyway, as long as Miss Hippamera likes it, Veronica smiled. She killed 3 Leviathan sons in the final battle of Rushta and solved a big problem for us. People are now asking about the identity of this priestess. If it weren't for the agreement with Brando, we would definitely let her be the hero. To boost morale? Freya asked. Veronica nodded. This war is too long, and now it's just a temporary end. We still have to divide our forces to continue the attack on the Hazel Plateau. On the other hand, the time is approaching. Hearing this, Freya's expression became a little heavy. The war is imminent? I don't think it's too far away. The allied forces of the demons and the nobles have already annexed Eloranta, and they will go south in the blink of an eye. And in the south, although the Twilight Army in the south of the Sea of the Dead Moon has not made any movements after the Battle of Madara Finhotos, news came from the south not long ago that the Dark Sanctum in Madara has discovered that the power of the Goddess of the Dead Moon has begun to be active again. The female Legion commander used a word to describe the current situation. It's already the calm before the storm, Freya. Is this why we have to return to Erewhon early? Yes, go and bring the news to Brando. We just have to wait for the Druids to confirm the news and return from outside the elemental frontier to see the current state of the world crystal wall. Veronica sighed. But I have a hunch that the final battle between us and the Twilight Dragon is just around the corner. But are we ready? Freya blinked, sighed softly, and asked. Even if we aren't, it's not up to us to choose, Veronica replied. For our world, for our survival, we must win. I understand. Freya suddenly bowed to the female Legion commander. No matter what, I will do my best, teacher. Veronica nodded with relief. I believe in you. You and Vahina are my favorite students. Although you are not from Cruz at this juncture, your identity is not important. I will pass on my life's knowledge to you in the hope that you can pass on these things in this war. Even in the face of defeat, I hope that you can protect yourself. Teacher, Veronica smiled slightly and said softly, consider this a kind reminder to my student, and also a little selfishness of mine. Freya, this is not a good thing for an excellent commander. Because a truly successful commander should be able to withstand failure first. The Valkyrie took a step back. Chapter 1532. So what's going on? The 3 of them sat on the ground and Brando asked, why do you want to go to Silver Bay all of a sudden, and what does this have to do with you, Nalathar? Didn't you return to the sacred Silver Valley? The trees rustled and the warm sunlight shone through the branches, leaving mottled spots of light on the green meadow. In the depths of the forest in the distance, a young deer was alertly pricking up its ears and looking over. There were a few bright mushrooms at the edge of the forest, and a snake with ring-shaped stripes was curled up in the bushes. Scarlet knelt beside Brando, looking at the quiet and languid afternoon scenery. Nalathar smiled and did not answer, leaving the right to answer to the Shire. The Shire smiled and replied, I just wanted to find my old self. Your grandfather was so famous, and as his attendant wizard, the name the Shire must have many stories. Of course, more importantly, Medisha and Miss Hippamera both got their own legacies, and I can't fall behind. What does this have to do with anything? Because the source of every planeswalker's power is related to experience, whether it's other people's or their own. The worlds they see in their travels form part of the laws they create. Brando saw that the Shire was serious and did not seem to be lying, so he asked, Then why Silver Bay? I don't know, but there's a vague impression in my memory, telling me that there's something I'm looking for there. And the result? The Shire sat up straight. I found something interesting. I found that when I was young, I studied under the Buga people, and lived in the Silver Bay area for a long time. Studied under the Buga people? My lord, you know that the Wizard of the Tower was once a follower of the Buga people, and we originally built a kingdom in the Silver Bay area. The so-called Silver Bay actually means the Silver Bay. After we broke with the Buga people, we crossed the sea to Karsuk, and then formed an alliance with the Highland Knight. But for hundreds of years, because of the same heritage, we have always maintained contact with Kanaichi, and even in every batch of excellent apprentices, some would be selected to study in Kanaichi. Brando nodded. With the Shire's talent and elemental quality, he could be called a genius among his peers, so it was not surprising that he was chosen by the Buga people. Subconsciously, I have a deep impression of the experience of living in Silver Bay, but it's always hard to remember some details. The memories of the past is like fragmented fragments that annoys me. It was only after I went to Silver Bay that did I remember many things, including the experiences before I became a wizard of the Black Tower. The Shire reminisced. I remember that when I could remember things, I moved with my family from Manaville to Karsuk. My mother died very early, and my father was the head of the family. In my memory, I only vaguely remember the appearance of the noble gentleman, somewhat serious, a very rigid knight. When I was very young, there were often some strange guests in the family. Later, I realized that those were elves, but not the wind elves of Saint Tossel. They had silver hair, silver eyes, extraordinary speech, and every move they made seemed to be born noble. Silver folk, silver elves. Brando subconsciously glanced at Nalathar. Nalathar nodded slightly. Charles paused for a moment before continuing. It was only later that I found out that those guests were my grandmother's relatives. It was said that my maternal great-grandfather had once married a silver elf lady of extraordinary status. From then on, my family and the silver elves formed an indissoluble bond. I have a deep memory of my experience of learning magic. Before I was sent to Abelia Tower, I remember that I had once learned magic from a silver elf. As far as I can remember, it was that esteemed Mr. who guided me on the path of a wizard until I became famous and was chosen by the wizards of the tower. But after that, he left Karsuk as my first teacher, and I have never seen this person again since then. Hearing this, Brando's heart skipped a beat, and he raised his head to look at the Shire. The Shire smiled slightly. Hearing this, my lord should have already guessed it, because later on, I met Hippet and Borg in Silver Bay, and under their introduction, I became your grandfather's wizard attendant. Mr. Borg is Miss Amandina's father. At that time, we also went through many things before we recognized each other's identity. Borg is a descendant of my grandmother's elder brother. He's also my distant cousin. You remembered all of this? There are still some details, but it's better not to mention them. The reason I was able to go to Holy Silver Valley to find Nalathar was because I remembered some of the inheritance of the silver folk. In fact, the most important part of my path as a wizard is the respected teacher who guided me on this path. As for his memories, I'm afraid that only the silver elves can give me the answer to this question. Then have you found the answer? Brando looked at the Shire. The Shire looked at Nalathar, who was beside him. At first, His Majesty did not know about the matter between Mr. Villefort and Her Royal Highness, but after so many things happened, we feel guilty towards the descendants of the late King Eric. Of course, on the other hand, everyone is anxious to find Her Royal Highness, who has been missing for a long time after leaving Holy Silver Valley, Nalathar replied. The one who taught Mr. the Shire magic is actually the younger brother of Princess Medisha and Princess Tiamas, the previous king of elves. Unfortunately, he died outside the elemental frontier 30 years ago. The leaves rustled, like the footsteps of a hero who was leaving. The Shire silently held up a blue card, showing this dazzling card of fate in front of Brando. That was his life. Hero of the Tower, choose a spell card from your deck and put it into your hand, then discard a card. If you have 3 or more spell cards in your graveyard, banish the Shire of the Tower to exile Hero of the Tower, then transfer him back to the battlefield under the control of his owner and convert him. Convert. The Shire of the Tower King. The Shire of the Tower King enters the battlefield with 5 mana counters. Add 1 mana counter. Reduce the power level of any target creature on the battlefield by 1 level. If the target's power level is lower than elemental power, destroy it. Reduce 3 mana counters. During this turn, you can cast any ability or spell card from your graveyard. If the card is to be placed into your graveyard this turn, shuffle it into your deck instead. If this card has more than 20 mana counters, banish the Shire of the Tower to exile Hero of the Tower, then transfer him back to the battlefield under the control of his owner and convert him into Hero of the Tower. The Planeswalker gains a negative level ability when the Planeswalker attacks the target creature. When the Shire of the Tower has 0 mana counters, banish the Shire of the Tower to exile Hero of the Tower, then transfer him back to the battlefield under the control of his owner and convert him into Hero of the Tower. Cannot be destroyed. The cold winter fog shrouded Fort Brown Raven. The towering towers on both sides of the recently completed fort stood in the fog, monitoring the Fanzin Plain in the north. That place used to be the most prosperous area, but now it was deserted and dead. Suddenly, there was a rush of horse hooves in the foggy forest, breaking the silence of the early morning. The soldiers on the tower hurriedly lowered the drawbridge. The iron chains clanked as the thick wooden planks hit the dry mud, kicking up a cloud of dust. A knight came out of the fog. He pulled on the reins of his horse and dismounted outside the gate. His body was drenched in sweat and dew. The soldiers immediately went up to him, took over the reins, handed him a water bag, and brought over another horse. The knight did not stop. He did not even have time to drink water. He quickly jumped on the back of another horse. "Open the gate!" he shouted and went around in a small circle. The gate on the other side of the stronghold had already creaked open. He whipped his horse and rushed out from that direction, leaving only the back of his figure for everyone to see. Such a scene was playing out in every fort north of Al-Kash. It was not even the 10th month of the year of spring, but a piece of news had already spread in the north. The Dusk Army in the north was recovering. Tens of millions of monsters were gathering in the 10 cities, east of El Aranta, and the Ring of the World. They were heading south. Outside the elemental frontier, the Buga mages who were monitoring the area also sent out messages. The Dusk Dragon was awakening. 5 years later, the last seal left by the Sage of the Earth had finally begun to loosen. At the same time, on the highlands south of Erewhon, the Karsuk people were welcoming a special celebration. After 3 years of reconstruction, the area from Diez Darlingi to Silver Horse City had already formed a solid defense line. In order to prepare for the upcoming war, the civilians had already been evacuated. The Caligos, who had lived here for generations, had also left their homeland for the first time to rebuild their new homes in Manowir and Viro. Now, only soldiers from various countries, adventurers, mercenaries from all over the world, and Buga mages were left here. Of course, there were also merchants from the rear. These merchants had spontaneously transported goods from Lantan Island, Grimoires, and other places to prepare for the long-awaited winter solstice festival. This was the most traditional festival in Karsuk. In most areas of Erewhon, there was also the custom of hunting and revelry on the winter solstice. It could even be said to be an important symbol of the old year in this ancient kingdom. Although the armies of different countries were left here, some of them came from different cultural areas. For example, the Wind Elves often fasted on the winter solstice to commemorate their heroes and sages who died in the War of the Holy Saints. But this year, at the end of the year of spring dawn, everyone did not know if there was any meaning in living tomorrow. So, people put aside their differences and joined the ranks of Erewhon to welcome the Grand Carnival. After night fell, in many areas, bonfires were lit all night long. From afar, they looked like a series of stars, dotting the dark highlands. All food and drinks were freely available at the carnival. The streets were hung with colorful tassels and flags. People sang and danced to their heart's content and wished each other well, hoping to survive the war. Knight from different areas even started a competition. At one point, it developed into a drunken riot, making the scene a mess. But people laughed, and when the drunken rioters sobered up, they shook hands with each other and left politely. Most of the noble officers turned a blind eye to what was happening below. They pretended that they didn't see anything. That was because there was also a banquet going on in the castle. People were toasting each other, and words of hope for victory could be heard everywhere. The only thing that was a little disappointing was that there weren't any beautiful and delicate noble ladies to liven things up. There were only a bunch of burly old men in the castle. But people also understood that the so-called carnival was just a ritual to boost morale and vent the depression in their hearts. They knew that perhaps the moment the sun rose tomorrow, when everyone put down their wine glasses, they might have to abandon everything and set foot on the battlefield of life and death. And that day was not too far away. This was Erewhon's last new year. Perhaps it would also be the last new year of this era. On the streets that were filled with a festive atmosphere, a pair of bright eyes observed everything with interest in the darkness. Then the merchant lady stood up and left 2 gold coins on the table. She thought for a moment and took one back. Then she walked into the crowd with her hands behind her back. She would remember this interesting memory. In her long life, this might be a rather interesting experience. But all of this would come to an end. The Roman chuckled softly. On the faraway city wall, the soldiers on duty were sounding the alarm. But it was not the arrival of the dusk army. Instead, a vast expanse of white fog appeared on the horizon. The fluorescent fog was so conspicuous under the night sky. The allied army of the Earth Legion and the Silver Elves finally retreated here. Found it! A surprised cry came from the dark abyss. Solomon and the dwarf king Caliphan both looked down. Although the huge explosion a few years ago had completely changed the terrain of the Deathfrost Forest, creating a huge rift valley in the north of the Falling Needle Hills. It was even said that across the tranquil Wind Mountain range, seawater poured into the rift from the north, forming several connected saltwater lakes and wetlands. One could imagine that under the erosion of the tidal force, this old appearance would completely disappear in a few years, becoming a new coastline north of Valendon that faced the Dark Star Sea. But fortunately, they still had time to find the stone tablet before all of this changed. Frost-Chant Sinna emitted a deep radiance in the darkness. A few knights excitedly climbed up the stone tablet from below. It was a rather simple and unique stone tablet, and it was also the last piece of the puzzle of the 7 stone tablets. Finally, before everything, the dwarf king Caliphan could not help but let out a long sigh. I hope it's not too late. Lady Martha bless us, let this last hope really come true. Solomon nodded. Behind him, Akani had already ordered the knights. Immediately bring it to the Abbey's territory and find the Flame King. Also, help us pass a message to the Flame King. My lord? Ajani turned her head and met Solomon's eyes, their silver eyes exchanging a look. In the end, the Mage King nodded his head, and the Dwarf King Caliphan also heavily placed his warhammer on the ground. Without waiting for the Queen of Silverfire to speak again, he replied in a gruff voice, "That's right. Tell His Excellency Flame King that everything has been prepared, and everyone is in their positions. Go and tell him that the war is imminent." Oh. Chapter 1533. Valhalla always looked particularly beautiful near the end of the year. The whole city was shrouded in a special atmosphere, warm and peaceful. Snowflakes floated outside the dark window. In the distance, Princess Street was lit up, and the light of magic was connected in the darkness, forming a bright necklace. Below them was a peaceful outer city. Lights were everywhere, and behind every window was a warm family. Above was a brightly lit mid-level platform, where the citizens were having a night of revelry. Kiara held her cheeks. His eyes twinkled with starry light as he stared at them enviously. This was her 3rd year living under the fence. Since the death of Levin Ornazan, Her Royal Highness sent her to this place in the name of marriage. But in essence, this was to keep Kiara away from her ill-intentioned relatives. After all, in House Cipher, there were still many people who coveted the inheritance of that title. Kiara was not uncomfortable with it. She did not like or hate the Abbeys, but she was interested in the Count, her nominal fiancé. In this era, women tended to have children at a very early age, especially noble girls. Kiara didn't really mind this marriage. After all, the other party was the spouse that her brother Ornazan had personally arranged for her, and he was so outstanding. If not, why would she give Cypher's heart to that person? The necklace itself was a token of love. But what made her a little annoyed was that her distant cousin always looked at her like she was a child, afraid that the Count would taint her. Humph, you just want to steal it yourself. Kiara frowned and pulled the quill. So annoying. What's wrong with being the descendant of Elkin III? Ling and Lotus looked at Kiara's movements in puzzlement. Elves grew slowly. A few years ago, the two of them looked the same size as Kiara, but now the latter had become more and more like a little sister. Compared with the two little girls, she had more ignorant troubles. Kiara, what's wrong with you? Lotus asked softly. You don't understand, Kiara replied impatiently. Ling replied faintly. Miss Amandina said that you can't go anywhere this year. I know. Kiara was so angry that she wanted to grab her hair. I don't need you to repeat it. Don't mess up your hair. Qianxi helped her fasten the last brass button and reminded her. Medisha was behind the three of them, holding Ling's hair and braiding it for her. She smiled and listened to the three girls talking. Although the two sisters were fostered under Scarlet's name, as her elder sister's daughters, they could be considered her true family in this world. Miss Amandina is too strict with them. Scarlet carefully adjusted Chiara's collar, straightened up and said to Medisha with a slight frown. The silver elf princess chuckled. Her eyes curved into crescents. She shook her head and said, "Then you'll have to tell her yourself." Scarlet's eyes widened. She didn't dare to provoke that strict young lady. Miss Amandina is also afraid that something will happen to them, Medisha said with a smile. After all, today is different from the past. The Twilight Army is pressing on the border, and the final battle is imminent. Although the Twilight Dragon's underlings in the Order realm have suffered great losses, it's hard to guarantee that they won't cause any trouble. She looked at the three girls and said, "But at the beginning of the new year, it's not a good idea to be cooped up at home. After the banquet is over, I'll take you to see the celebration." Chiara suddenly raised her head, her eyes almost shining. "Really, Sister Medisha?" "Of course, but you have to be obedient later," Medisha said seriously. Yeah. The three girls cheered together after all, having the temperament of a child. With a whoosh, the cold wind mixed with snowflakes rushed into the warm hall. Even the bright flames in the furnace dimmed by a few degrees. Amandina, Maynard, and Allium Japonicum pushed open the door to the courtyard from outside. A thin layer of snow had accumulated on the shoulders of their windbreakers. Allium Japonicum took off his windbreaker and handed it to Falerne, who had a serious expression on her face. He looked at them with a smile and asked, "What are you so happy about?" "Humph." Chiara snorted softly. "Sister Medisha wants to take us out to play." Lotus replied very obediently. "That's not bad. The tone you use to coax children," Chiara said lightly. Amandina glared at her sternly. Everyone laughed secretly, and Medisha also lowered her head and chuckled. Amandina asked Falerne, who was beside her, "Are there any other guests? I saw a carriage outside." The tip of Falerne's ears twitched. The elf lady was staring at her sister. Tia, who had sneaked over to a long table, stuck out her tongue embarrassedly and obediently put down the gingerbread in her hand. She then opened her mouth and replied, "Princess Griffine and Princess Magadal are upstairs in the study." Only then did Amandina nod. She looked at the three girls carefully and said in a rare gentle tone, "Remember not to cause trouble for Miss Medisha." "Understood," a crisp voice answered. Brando looked at this scene warmly by the fireplace, a little lost in thought. This Castle Abes was like his home in this world, and every member was a part of this family. Whether it was Medisa, Scarlet, Amandina, Senior, Ling, Lotus, or the others, although they didn't know what the future would be like, there was no doubt that everyone cherished the time they had now. Just like the last days of the year of spring, during this new year people understood that perhaps for a long, long time in the future, they would remember these last days of peace. In the days to come, people would witness more and more of the spreading flames of war, death, parting, and sorrow. It would be more tragic than any war that the civilized world had ever experienced. Brando asked without blinking, "Is there any news of Carglass?" The Shire behind him slowly shook his head. "No, but after the incident we searched the entire Bernasal and the surrounding areas, and did not find Mr. Carglass' body. We can only conclude that he is missing." Brando sighed. He knew that there were too many strange abilities and spells in this world. Even if they did not find the body, there was no guarantee that Carglass would be completely safe. Presumably, when Carglass covered Haru's and Mikaya's escape, he must have prepared himself for everything. Brendel felt a little disappointed. Back then, he was the one who had led this young man onto this path. He had promised to protect his marriage with Maria, and now that the old nobleman had finally agreed, this outstanding young man would not be able to wait for that day to come. Her Highness has also asked about this matter. The astrologers believe that this is not a sign of death. Perhaps we have not lost all hope. The Shire replied, "I think so too, but I can't free myself now. The situation in Karsuk is getting worse by the day, and the local affairs have been entrusted to the patrolling cavalry of Lantanailan." Brando nodded, understanding that this was the only way. He gently put down the letter in his hand and flattened the corner of the paper with his fingers. After a while he asked again, "The Shire, what is Gaia?" The Shire looked at the letter and hesitated for a moment. "Is this the letter that Mistress White wrote to you?" Brando nodded. "Then for this question, my lord, you should ask Ovina or Miss Andrea." After all, they are the only ones who know about the mythological era of the past. The Shire replied. The fire in the fireplace not far away burned, and the red light reflected on one side of his face. I asked them. Oh, what did they say? Gaia is not part of Tiamat's authority, and only Martha knows of Gaia's existence. Its duty is to nurture life. The curved surface project that created me was completed by Martha, with the help of Gaia's power. Tiamat's network only provided the necessary energy for this project. It was because of this that the Twilight Dragon was successfully fooled. The Shire was surprised to hear this and asked, "Doesn't that mean that Gaia does not have the authority of Tiamat's law, and is not a god?" Brando nodded. That seems to be the case. I remember that in the era of the divine people, Gaia was not a real god. The main god of the Temple of the Earth was the goddess of the mountains, Himalud. Although the lion men and dwarves of Toquinen respectfully called Gaia the mother of the earth, there is no record of this goddess participating in the war in the Pale poem of the past. The Shire frowned, and suddenly remembered something. But Brando asked, "What if she is not a goddess of war?" "But her authority is not within Tiamat's law, unless her power is equal to Martha's," the Shire answered firmly. Another main god. Brando remembered the girl he saw in the stagnant realm, who looked very similar to Sifrit, and shook his head. He had seen Martha, and he had seen the power that could control the entire Tiamat's law with her every move. That kind of majestic and all-encompassing power, as if she owned the entire world. Gaia might know many secrets, and she was wise as if she could see through everything, but the feeling she gave him was completely different. The Shire looked at him and suddenly asked, "My lord, why do you ask about this?" Brando shook his head and replied, "Haku said in the letter that she would leave us all with a hope. I originally thought that she only wanted to resurrect Medisha, but now it seems that her scheme is far from that. She went through untold hardships to obtain Gaia's power, and even had to abandon her mortal feelings. Why is that?" "She is a very ambitious woman, my lord." Brando looked at the Shire. "Are you still brooding over the matter of your great-grandfather?" The latter shook his head. "Not to that extent. I just want to say that there may not be only one Ekis in this world." Brando nodded. But in his heart, he had a faint feeling that perhaps Haku was not lying to him about this matter. What was the so-called hope? Grufine looked at the bright lights of Valhalla from afar. She put down the white porcelain teacup with both hands, and the fragrance of the tea filled the study. She looked up and fixed her gaze on her best friend. "When you were in Vlada, did you ever think of this day, Magadal?" Magadal smiled and shook her head. "Grufine, I will tell you, even in the craziest and most absurd dreams, I never thought that there would be a day like this. Would you believe me?" Grufine did not answer. But the silence was the answer to all the questions. Yes, who would have thought of this? Their fates had taken a 180-degree turn at the intersection of Ampere Seal, and it was all because of the same person. Grufine gently rubbed the edge of the teacup with her slender fingertips. "Sometimes I even have an illusion that this is not my real fate. Maybe it is just a dream. I am afraid that I will wake up from this dream, because these days I often have a nightmare that makes me wake up in the middle of the night in cold sweat." "What kind of nightmare is that, my friend?" Magadal asked. "Maybe you have been worrying too much these days. Why don't you tell me so that I can share some of your worries? Maybe you will feel better." "Thank you, Magadal," Grufine said softly. "In my dream I dreamed of a different heroine where I did not meet Brando. After we parted ways in Vlada, I was betrayed by the royal faction in Ampere Seal, and I had no choice but to marry Arak and become his tool to raise his children. The conditions that the nobles promised me were nothing but beautiful lies. I saw Haruz die in front of me with my own eyes, and Aween eventually fell into a sea of fire. I tried my best to save everything, but what awaited me in the end was nothing more than a sharp blade." The princess' voice began to tremble. "But what killed me was not a conspiracy but endless despair. Magadal, can you understand that feeling? There was no hope, and it was a dark path that led straight to the abyss and death." Magadal said softly, "But that was just a dream. You met Mr. Brando in the end, didn't you?" Grufine took a deep breath. She calmed herself down and replied, "Thank you, Magadal. Perhaps that is the case. I still remember the first time Oberway described him to me. The scene of that day is still vivid in my mind. After that, I exchanged letters with him and used the brooch as a keepsake. That was probably the boldest thing I did in my life. But now that I think about it, I was so lucky at that moment. Magadol looked at her friend gently, but her eyes were full of envy. You are indeed lucky, Graphine. Princess Graphine raised her head and looked at her. Are you tempted too, Magadol? How can I not be? Magadol replied honestly. He changed the course of my life and entered my heart. No matter what, I can't forget his place in my heart. I thought that I should live a normal life, but it turns out that a peaceful life is not as easy as I thought. It was Mr. Brando who made me understand this. Graphine was speechless. Yes, perhaps only when that moment comes people will understand. Even if they were to hold on to everything that was precious, it would still be a luxury. Both of them looked at the lights in the darkness. Have you ever thought that this might be the last new year we will see in our lives, Magadol? But people still carefully guard this last bit of light. I hope the long night will pass. Freya checked her warhorse one last time. She patted the neck of the beast, smoothed its fur, and carefully fed it with hay and beans before carefully leaving the stable. In the distance, the soldiers of the White Lion Legion were cleaning their weapons and armor. Although it was the new year, the whole camp was bustling with activity. Everyone was making their final preparations. After today, they would leave their homeland and go to the highlands to participate in the real war. Although it was the first time for many of them to go to the battlefield, they were very brave and joking with each other. A young soldier was excitedly discussing his future wife and life after the war. Although many of them knew that most of them would not be able to return to this land. But they encouraged each other. Everyone clearly understood that the reason why they were willing to die was because they could not let go of their worries. And the reason why they chose to leave was because they loved everything here. Freya stood silently in the darkness. But what was the reason for her worries? Was it just for Erwin? Or was it for everyone in Buchi? She looked at the young soldier's face from afar, and the happy smile on his face. She felt a stab of pain in her heart. It was like that night in Bragg's. The bright moonlight shone in the small alley of Bragg's, and melodious music came from the tavern like a nocturne. The two of them looked at each other. She could still remember how she had dressed up in her favorite military uniform, but that stupid guy hadn't seemed to notice. He had only told her about the things she needed to pay attention to in the future, and then put on the ring she had given him with his own hands. Now do you understand why I want you to go to the Royal Knight Academy, Freya? Because Freya, I need your help. Aween's goddess of war bit her lips as tears rolled down her cheeks. I don't know. But I'm only doing it for you. All of this is... She covered her mouth and turned around, but she did not expect to bump into someone. Freya lost her balance and almost fell backwards, but a hand caught her before she could fall. The girl from Buchi raised her head in astonishment, and the first thing she saw was a familiar, tall figure. In that instant, tears rolled down her cheeks uncontrollably. Brando looked at the girl silently, and his heart was filled with mixed feelings. He, Freya, and the Roman were all from Buchi, and the three of them were the most familiar with each other. But he never thought that he would occupy such an important position in the heart of this innocent girl. He gently wiped away the tears on the goddess of war's face, and suddenly regretted it. He regretted the decision he made at that time. He finally understood how heartless it was to let Freya go to the Royal Knight Academy alone, to an environment that was completely foreign to her. But for him, this naive and innocent girl from the countryside of Buchi had chosen this path without hesitation. Freya looked at Brando's hand in a daze. On his index finger there was a shining ruby ring, exactly the same as that time. This is... She almost could not believe her eyes. I'm sorry, Freya, Brando answered clumsily. I accidentally broke the ring you gave me. This ring was specially made by Master Tamar. I can't accompany you to Karsuk tomorrow, but I hope it can protect you on my behalf. Tears came out again, but this time they were tears of happiness. Freya looked at Brando with tears in her eyes as he carefully lifted her hand, and then put on the ring with both hands. At that moment, she felt like she was going to faint. Accompany me to the banquet, okay? Brando took Freya's hand and was about to lead her out. But Freya stopped. Brando looked back at her, and the girl firmly shook her head. She seemed to have gathered all her courage and said, I'm going to the battlefield tomorrow, Brando. But I don't know if I can come back alive. Tonight let me be willful for once, okay? It was like a lily quietly blooming in the night. Brando stared at Freya for a long time without saying anything. Chapter 1534. Lightning that did not belong to this season flashed among the heavy clouds in the sky. Bolts of lightning fell one after another. Under the light purple sky, there was a vast wilderness plateau. "They're here!" Someone shouted in the wind as the flag was blown by the wind. A tiny spot appeared on the horizon, followed by a second and a third. More and more spots appeared, gradually forming a sparkling line. Like a rising tide, a thin line of water appeared at the intersection of the sky and the sea. Then there was the majestic sea. On the jagged line stood tall figures that had never been seen before. They were the Crystal Cluster Lords. The projection of Leviathan's descendants appeared in the sky. The tail of a giant whale swam up and down in the clouds. After the clouds parted, a huge black sphere was revealed. It was like a hollow eye staring at the barren plateau. Everyone quieted down. The crowd suddenly parted to form a path. Freya, wearing the white lion armor, walked up to the city wall accompanied by the knight. The sharp turbulence ruffled the mane on her collar. Her white mane stood up one by one and fluttered behind her. The girl's dark eyes reflected the purple lightning, and it seemed to light up her eyes. Her long hair fluttered in front of her snow-white forehead. The softness in her eyes was more charming and gentle than the heroic female knight in the past. Everyone felt the change in their commander's temperament. Freya was like a newlywed wife. She held the ring tightly and pursed her lips as she looked at the scene. A few kilometers away, the trembling of the earth could be heard. The cold wind came from the plateau of Karsuk. It blew along the Tosankade forest and across the entire southern territory. Everything withered and frosted, and the world was already covered in silver. Brando stood in the biting cold wind. The wind seemed to carry the scent of the distant plateau. It was warm and familiar. He lowered his head and looked at the strand of hair in his hand. It was still tied with a ribbon. He could not help but feel lost. She was gone, but her fragrance still lingered. Outside Castle Abes, snow fell quietly in the pine forest, and the cold wind swayed the branches. Under the tall black pine, Haruz stood beside his sister. The rolling snowflakes pulled at his long cloak, but the young king did not say a word. His bright eyes glistened with tears as he looked at his teacher. "Even if we can see each other off for 1,000 miles, we still have to part in the end." Brando turned around and carefully kept the strand of hair close to his body. He smiled and said, "Let's stop here. After all, we have to step onto different battlefields in this war. I don't want to say anything to boost morale. I just want to say that we should wait for each other in this battle that will decide our future. There is still hope for everything. Perhaps one day, everyone will be able to gather here again." The people who stood proudly in the cold wind were King Solomon, the dwarf King Caliphan, the great druids Grey Fury and Sifrid, and then the people of Abes. Amandina stood in front of everyone, and behind her were Rabban, Cornelius, Odom, Kodum, Reto and Tamar. Tajiv, the cave-dweller king, had passed away a few years ago. His son Takub stood behind everyone together with Uriel, who had retired from the White Lion Legion a year ago. Then there were the nobles of Erewhon, led by Oberway. Behind them were Count Audine, whose hair had turned white, and Marjorie and Eugenie, who had been married for 2 years. Next to him was Avram, who was said to have recently gotten together with Yaidini, and had gained the favor of the Count of Grey Mountain. Beside him, Yaidini was still looking at their commander with some worry. She was still a timid and kind girl. Levin's maid Edessa stood beside Chiara in a black dress. Finally there was Dilfri and her father Count Yenbao. Brando had met the Cow Knight, Nia and Ronan in Ampere Seal. Adney and Quill were also among the crowd. They had stayed in Erewhon for half a year, and would soon return to Rubik to lead the people of the desert to the Great Plains, where they would build a new home. Everyone's eyes fell on Brando. "Teacher." Haruz choked a few times, almost unable to say anything. Haruz stopped crying. "His Majesty the King of Erewhon can't cry so easily," Brando said with a smile. "But..." Haruz looked at him with tears in his eyes, and said with a sobbing voice, "Teacher, I want to go with you." Brando couldn't help but find it funny. He looked at Princess Grafine, but found that Her Royal Highness had turned her head away. He sighed, walked in the snow to Haru's side, raised his hand and tapped his crown with his knuckles. The little prince raised his head and looked at his teacher. His silver eyes were watery, and his eyelashes were long and dense. He blinked with some confusion. Brando knocked 3 times and asked, "Do you feel the weight?" "The weight is on your head. Authority, obligation, responsibility. Don't let it down." Sparkling and translucent tears rolled down from his eyes. Brando turned back and looked at Amandina. "Tonajal, I'll have to trouble you." Amandina didn't even look at him. She lowered her head and nodded silently. "Your Royal Highness." "I don't want to hear it," Griffin said lightly. "But I order you to come back alive and marry me." Brando was stunned. Then he smiled slightly. He bent down to straighten Haru's collar and straightened the little prince's gleaming silver lily brooch on his collar. He straightened up and took one last look at everyone, especially the citizens of Tonajal. His gaze swept over the familiar faces one by one. Then he turned around. The wind and snow rose all over the sky, as if only a lonely figure was left. There was silence in the snow. The faint winter sunlight slanted into a beam and sprinkled in the corridor. The patter of footsteps came closer from afar. Sue held a large pile of clothes in her hands and walked in the empty corridor expressionlessly. The sunlight cast a crisscrossing shadow on her face, revealing her healthy wheat-colored skin. Her appearance had become more and more picturesque over the years. Due to her tall stature and slender figure, this daughter of the red copper dragon had long been a well-known beauty in the Ferber region. Many nobles had openly or secretly expressed their admiration for her. Even many people in the White Lion Legion had expressed their love for her. The young commander of the Silver Fleet, Manrique, was one of the many suitors. But the girl refused all of them without hesitation. For many years, she had been quietly leading the Abbey's castle as the head maid. In fact, she had taken over Falern's job in the past. She stopped in front of a door and knocked. Then she turned the knob and pushed the door open. "Miss Yuta, change of clothes." However, the situation in the room made Sue stunned for a moment. The snow-white bed was empty, and only the messy bedsheets proved that someone had been here before. The window on one side was open. The cold wind poured in from outside. The curtains fluttered. The snow even fell on the desk, then melted into ice water and dripped onto the wooden floor. "Miss Yuta." He walked silently in the wind and snow. In her memory, the entrance of the tomb was near the bottom of the valley, and the few broken pillars were still standing there. Amidst the bushes, the pillars were covered with a thick layer of snow. The stone pillars were not maintained properly, and their condition was worse than before. Many of the words on the pillars had been smoothed out. After arriving here, Brando stood there for a moment. The scene when he discovered this place was still fresh in his mind. Although some details were already blurred, his memory of the people and things had become even more vivid. He could still remember the names of the White Lion Legion's knights. Some of them died in Ampere Seal, Menta or Cruz. Some were injured and left the White Lion Legion, and some were already married and had children. There were also some who were still fighting on the plateau of Karsuk, fighting for the future of mankind. Brando's hand gently pressed against his chest. His heartbeat was slow and strong, but his thoughts were very complicated. He could always vaguely see the merchant lady in front of him, frowning as she looked at him. He reached out to pinch her face, the delicate touch still lingering in his fingers. "Brando, I tied myself to the horse. How is it? Amazing, right? Ha ha ha. There's no problem with me like this. Ah, it hurts." Then, everything vanished into thin air. Brando smiled and put away his thoughts. He lowered his head and entered the tomb. In the darkness was a dim corridor. The smell of dust, mold, and mud floated in the air. Simple stone pillars supported the 4 walls of the tomb. Brando recalled as he walked. There was originally an agate light barrier here, and behind it was a tomb. They were attacked by ghouls there for the first time. He saw a stone platform and remembered that there used to be a fire raven's tongue on it. It was a brass-ranked magic longsword, and it was still Janna's sword to this day. Behind it was the large stone coffin. He took out the stone pieces from his chest. One of them looked like a chisel, and it was found in this coffin. Brando gently put the stone piece back. He didn't need it now. He raised his head. The collapsed part of the tomb had already been dug up. Underneath it was the place where he fought the pendulum golem with the deer banshee. A slim figure walked out from the darkness. Elaine, who had recovered from her crystallization sickness, looked at him with a lazy smile. "You're here." Brando nodded. "Where are the others?" "They're all ready." "You don't have to go, Miss Elaine." "Sister Elaine," Elaine corrected him. "There's no point in staying outside. Everyone is participating in this war. How can I stay out of it?" Brando nodded silently. The two of them walked down the stairs and entered the caves. They once again passed through Eleanor's labyrinth, and then came the endless crystal belt. Brendel once again stopped in front of the huge crystal. Kelsey, the witch queen, and the middle-aged swordsman were still very much alive. It was as if the crystal seal had sealed their lives away, and at the same time stopped the erosion of time for 1,000 years. Brando silently bowed to the three of them, then walked past them and continued forward. Elaine looked at him from behind. She didn't say a word, but there was a trace of respect in her eyes. Mysterious patterns began to appear on the red surface of the ground. The signs of magic erosion had become more serious in the past 5 years. Some of the cracks even seeped out purple light. Brando looked at these details. He understood that for a seal that had been maintained for thousands of years, 5 years was just a blink of an eye. The continuously rising tide of magic was the main culprit. Just like the elemental border's world wall, with the awakening of the Twilight Dragon, the seal was on the verge of collapse. But what exactly was down there? Was it just the throne of destiny? The two of them finally came in front of the gate. The cave area became extremely open here. Circles of golden ripples rippled in the space. When one approached these ripples, one could see a golden translucent magic circle that was slowly rotating, like the hands of a clock. Even the flow of time seemed to be accelerated here. Brando seemed to be able to see the passing of life through the flowing sand, but he immediately shook his head. He knew that it was just an illusion caused by the distortion of the huge magic power. This was the ultimate dungeon in the world of the Amber Sword, the accuracy of time. Brando saw other people here. The Shire, Medisha, Mephistopheles and Hippamera were standing in front of the gate. The Nightsong Tiger and his team, Malurcha and Ropar, were further away. When he arrived, a joyful cheer came from the darkness. The little female dragon appeared from the other side of the darkness. Flora stood not far from her. Allah's golden pupils seemed to be burning with a circle of flames as she looked at Brando. "You're finally here. I've been waiting for you for a long time." Brando looked at everyone first. His gaze met each of his subordinates one by one, and they responded to each other's gazes. Then he replied to Allah's. "Allah's, thank you for coming." The little female dragon raised her chin. "Of course, Mithril is enough for the mortal battlefield. But this war is equally important to us. After all, this is a direct battle with the Twilight Dragon. Solomon hopes that the dragons can also contribute. After all, we are the last of the golden race. Of course, the key is that I'm worried about you." "The key is the last sentence," Flora said. Alaz looked at her partner in annoyance. Brando smiled, but his gaze fell on a person in the crowd. Scarlet. The Highlander girl's face was slightly pale, and she subconsciously took a step back. No matter what, this was the first time she disobeyed the Lord's orders. But she clenched the spear in her hand. She knew what this battle meant. No matter what, she would never leave Brando again. The girl had already made up her mind. But Brando looked at her and did not say what she expected. Instead, he said very seriously, "Follow me closely later. You're slightly weaker." Scarlet looked up in disbelief. Brando smiled at her. "If I fail, there's no point in staying there. If you want to stay by my side, then do as you wish." Scarlet's eyes turned red almost immediately, but she quickly turned her head away and wiped her eyes. Brendel walked past her and raised his head to look at the huge door of light. Everyone fell silent. This was because everyone present knew very well what it meant once they stepped through the door. Brendel was silent for a moment before he turned around and asked everyone, "What do you think?" Although the purpose of each of us coming here has long since been clear. But at this moment I still want to ask each and every one of you, are you ready? Everyone nodded in agreement. Then come. Brando took a deep breath. Face the throne of destiny. Face the twilight. Chapter 1535. Countless rays of light shuttled back and forth in front of his eyes, colorful and vibrant. Behind the layers of light, in just a short step, Brando felt like he had gone through a long time. Finally, he stepped on solid ground. When he came back to his senses, the scene in front of him had already changed. The underground cave had disappeared, and so had the light door. In the darkness, he could no longer see the layers of stalagmites and the mysterious magic erosion patterns. All that was left in front of him was a thick fog and an endless dark void. Scarlet appeared behind him. The girl held the azure lance in her hand and looked at the place in a daze. This was the world behind the door. A world surrounded by thick fog. A huge tree root pierced through the fog and hung in the darkness. Compared to this tree root, humans were like tiny specks of dust. Around the tree root was an empty abyss. In the darkness, there was a faint whistling sound of wind, like a sinister and terrifying ghost laugh. The two of them stood on top of the tree root, their front and back completely engulfed by the thick fog. The monotonous sound of the wind surrounded their ears, but other than that, there was a sense of loneliness around them. The whistling wind was moving noisily in the depths of the darkness, but the thick fog around them was motionless. It was as if the world was still. After Scarlet, Medisha and Hipamra also arrived one by one. The Shire followed behind the Nightsong Tiger and was the last to appear. He stepped on the ground and there was a crisp crack. He looked down and found that he had stepped on a thin layer of ice. What the hell is this place? The Shire exhaled, and the hot air quickly condensed into white fog. Everyone found that the temperature around them was very low, and even the fog was a thin layer of ice dust. There was a layer of frost on the tree trunk they were standing on. But it was not just the cold. There seemed to be an ominous aura lingering in the darkness, and it seeped into their bones. Before the Shire finished his words, a shrill scream came from behind them. Brendel turned his head sharply and saw a monster with wings under its armpits breaking through the fog. But Scarlet had already stepped in front of him and stabbed with the azure lance, nailing the thing to the tip of the lance. Only then did everyone see the appearance of the monster clearly. It was a creature that was as thin as a match and looked like a bat. However, its entire body was pitch black, and they couldn't see its face clearly. It was like a shadow that was splashed with thick ink. Its limbs were thin and long, and there was only a thin opening where each of its eyes should be. Scarlet threw it to the ground, and the monster screamed and struggled for a moment before dying. A shadow monster? The Shire was stunned when he saw the thing and could not help but ask, "This is the Shadow Kingdom?" Medisha and the Shire replied, and the darkness around them reflected in her silver eyes. "Although the time here is much faster than the physical world, it should be a lower realm. Do you smell it?" "Smell what?" The Shire sneezed and complained, "I just feel that it's too damn cold here, achoo." Mephistopheles looked at him curiously. "Is it cold here, Mr. the Shire? But I feel a little comfortable. There's something about this place that makes me feel peaceful, as if I'm beside the Lord." He looked at Andrique and asked, "What do you think, sister?" "Except for the last point," Andrique replied coldly. "I agree with everything." Scarlet frowned and wiped the tip of her lance. She looked at the ugly corpse and whispered to Brando beside her, "My lord, what is the lower realm?" Brando looked at the world and replied, "The lower realm is the foundation of our world. These worlds are made up of simple laws and are the projections of these laws. The shallow sea of the elemental frontier, the river of scorching heat, the stone pivot, and the mountain of ceasing storms are also such worlds, but they are of a higher level. These worlds are at the bottom of the Tiamat network, such as the Shadow Realm and the Dust World. Because the laws in these worlds are incomplete, the flow of time is faster than the physical world." Alaz also added, "Yes, in short, the Tiamat network that runs through our world is a tree. The lower the tree, the simpler the foundation of the laws, and the higher the tree, the more complicated the branches are. In the trunk of this tree, the lowest part of it is a world made up of the simplest and most basic laws. This is the lower realm. Further up, there are the more complicated four elemental realms. They also surround our world at the same time, known as the peripheral world or the elemental frontier. Our world is located in the middle of all the worlds, but it is not just the wound. These worlds are collectively known as the material world, which can also be called the middle realm or the middle realm. Above the middle realm, there is the upper realm, such as the silver plains and the divine kingdom of the divine people, the truth realm, the court of judgment, and the gate of judgment. This knowledge was obviously too profound for Scarlet. She slowly blinked her eyes. Her watery eyes seemed a little confused in the darkness and asked, "Then which world is this?" "This is the kingdom of the dead, the underworld of Helm." The little fairy Lute, who was sitting on Ropar's shoulder, said, "It is not a fog, but the breath of death. In the depths of the darkness, it is not the wind, but the sound of the whole world walking towards death." "Death?" The little female dragon sniffed hard. Her eyes were like two golden flames in the darkness, shining brightly. "But the smell in this fog is not rotten or rotten at all," Lute quietly replied. "The breath of death is not a rotten corpse. The corpse is just a representation of death. Death is a state, symbolizing eternal sleep, and everything here is dead. In the fog are the corpses of wind and water. The living cannot smell the breath of death. The reason Miss Medisha can is because the elves are very sensitive to life and death. No wonder we feel peaceful," Mephistopheles also realized. "So this is the land of eternal sleep, the home of the dead." But Alaz was still not satisfied and continued to nitpick. "Everything here is dead? But aren't we still alive?" "That's because we didn't come in through the normal way." The fairy on Melurch's head stood up. She grabbed two long antlers and said, "Although I don't know why Abies can lead to the underworld of Helm, this is obviously not the real entrance to the kingdom of the dead. The real entrance to the kingdom of the dead is under the Styx of Dagir. Do you see the surrounding abyss? Below this abyss should be the Sea of Styx. The foundation of the world is constantly collapsing into the Sea of Styx, which is why there is such a roar." The fairy looked at Lute proudly and snorted. "The Sea of Styx is originally below the shallow sea. I know more about this place than that guy." Lute glanced at her, too lazy to argue with the little girl. "The Sea of Styx is the Sea of Chaos?" The Night Song Tiger asked. "You can say that it is, but you can also say that it isn't. The Netherworld Sea is a part of the law of Tiamat, but it is indeed built on the Chaos Sea." Brendel nodded slowly. He looked up at the huge tree root beneath his feet. The others also looked at the tree root, and someone asked, "Is this the legendary root of the world tree?" "Yes." The silver elf princess looked at the tree root with some shock, and replied with certainty, "The world tree itself is the manifestation of the law of Tiamat. I finally understand why there is a world tree in the loop of trade winds. Under Abies, Lady Martha sealed an entrance to the underworld of Helm. Legend has it that one of the three roots of the world tree leads to this world. The loop of trade winds must be affected by the law of this place to project the world tree. I heard that there is also a world tree in the loop of the world. What's the deal with that world tree?" The Shire asked again. Medisha blinked in confusion and looked at him. "Didn't the Bugas tell you?" The Shire coughed awkwardly. "I'm not a real silver wizard after all. For a mortal wizard, not all documents in the White Tower can be read." "I see." Medisha smiled apologetically and then replied, "The world tree is the manifestation of the law of Tiamat. As Miss Alaz described earlier, it is connected to every world created by Martha and the divine people. So in every world there will be at least one world tree. My lord, you have been to the Silver Plains, so you should have seen the legendary Black Tower." Brando was surprised. "That's the world tree." Medisha nodded. "The dwarves built a fortress on it, and so did Valhalla. So the World Tree Fortress is one of the 5 legendary fortresses, an existence on par with Babel Fortress." She smiled sweetly and said with a hint of nostalgia, "The World Tree also grows in my hometown, in the Holy Land of the Elves, the Silver Valley of Alfheim. There is also a giant tree like Valhalla. It is like our mother, so the Silver Elves are so familiar with the World Tree." "Can we reach any world through the World Tree?" Brando asked. "Yes, but that's not entirely true." At this point, the Silver Elf Princess was a little sad. Today's existing physical world, the continent of Vaunt, is only a small part of the whole world, but it's also almost the only part left. Most of the world was destroyed in the past war, or disappeared because of the reboot. If my lord still remembers the planeswalker Mr. Kelsey, you should know that he came from such a world, but his homeland has long since disappeared. Just like the stagnation realm. Just like the stagnation realm. You have never told me this before. Did Fuchsia remind you of something in the past, Medisha? Brando looked at the silver elven princess, a little curious about her reaction. Medisha nodded. The moment I was resurrected, I understood everything in the past. Brando could not help but be silent. He paused for a moment before replying, no matter what, everything we are doing now is to prevent the tragedy from happening again. Since the flow of time in the lower realm is much faster than in the wound, then the time left for us is even more precious. Let's go. Only then did the group move forward. But she was a little puzzled as to how to find the right direction in such a place. She looked up and saw that there was more than one route in the fog. In the deep darkness, the intertwining roots densely covered the entire space, and it was like a huge maze. But Brando immediately used his actions to answer her doubts. He took out the 7 stone slabs from the floating sphere. The 7 stone slabs were pieced together into a sphere that floated in his hand. The entire sphere emitted a soft light, like a lighthouse. The light sphere shot a beam of light in one direction, and the beam of light disappeared into the fog. This was the most precious inheritance that Amandina's father had left for them, and its name was Hope. The group moved forward under the guidance of the light, and the fog in the darkness was sometimes thick and sometimes thin. The surrounding terrain also changed with the meandering and intertwining of the roots. Not long after, Tia, who was beside Ferlin, kicked something. She screamed in shock and Brando rushed forward to support the little girl, only to find that Tia had kicked a corpse. The corpse had the typical characteristics of an insect-like creature, like some kind of arthropod, but its body was made up of pieces of translucent purple crystals. Brando only needed a glance to know what kind of creature it was. He frowned slightly, not expecting to see such a thing here. This is a crystal cluster? Alaz also recognized it. This is not a normal crystal cluster, Brando replied. This is a crystal cluster, Lord. Strange, did the dusk invade this place? The Shire walked up from behind and lightly poked the corpse with his staff. With a soft crack, one of the crystal cluster corpse's legs disintegrated and shattered into pieces. He saw this scene and shook his head. This thing has been around for a long time, and is not a product of our era. In the past, even the kingdom of the dead had a dusk war. It may not be the main battlefield, but the underworld of Helm is the kingdom of the goddess of the dead moon. Before she fell, she was also a powerful god, so it is not strange that she fought with the minions of the dusk. Alaz replied, and she frowned. I even have a suspicion that this is the battlefield where she fell. Everyone subconsciously raised their heads and looked forward. In the fog in front of them, a long bridge had appeared out of nowhere. What is that? The little fairy Fenice asked subconsciously, but Medisha raised a finger and said to everyone, Shoo! Behind the fog, 2 crimson light spots appeared. They looked like 2 balls of fire floating in the air, swaying slowly as they got closer and closer to the group. Soon, a tall figure appeared behind the light spots, and Brando could see that it was a huge skeleton. He used to think that Cabia's was the strongest skeleton he had ever seen, but compared to this terrifying skeleton, it paled in comparison. It was actually the skeleton of a giant. He held a huge anchor in one hand and a lantern that emitted light that could penetrate the fog in the other. He swayed as he walked forward. Is that an undead? Someone asked in a low voice. It is not an ordinary undead. Brando recognized the skeleton and gulped. That is Modgud, the king of skeletons, the guardian of the bridge of the dead, the ancestor of the undead. It is said that it will not allow the breath of the living to enter the world of the dead and disturb the peace of the sleeping. My lord, do you mean that it will not let us pass? The Nightsong Tiger asked. Then what do we do? Scarlet frowned. That is simple, the Shire replied. We kill it, of course. Oh. Chapter 1536. Under a wave of bright radiance, Valhalla's main trunk gradually disappeared, turning into scattered pieces of light from bottom to top, all the way until the branches and leaves. In the end, the specks of light dissipated bit by bit, leaving behind only a vast forest and clear winter sky in the empty valley. Amandina stood rooted to the ground for a moment until the wind blew the strands of hair in front of her forehead. She lowered her head and put on her veil. She turned to the 2 white lion knights and said, Let's return to Ferber. A knight opened the door of the carriage for her. Amandina took one last look at the valley where Valhalla was before she entered the carriage and closed the door. Under the escort of the knights, the carriage slowly moved forward, passing through the familiar forest. Amandina had passed through this path more than once to return to Abes. The quiet forest allowed her to calm down and think, but today the forest was so quiet that it annoyed her. Just like the unusually cold and cheerless Firs Hill at this moment, the unpredictability of the future, uneasiness and hesitation, lingered in her heart. She only felt helpless when she was alone. When Amandina thought of a terrible possibility, that she would never see Brando again, even her heart tightened. Amandina's face was frighteningly pale, and she was on the verge of tears, but she held the seat tightly and silently prayed that everything would eventually pass, and that Lady Martha would protect that person's safety. But the violent shaking of the carriage woke her from her thoughts. Amandina suddenly raised her head and heard the whistling of the air being torn apart outside. Arrows were shot at the carriage, and she quickly lowered her head in fear. The knight shouted outside the carriage, "It's the scum of the Order of Chaos, be careful, protect the carriage." Then came the sound of weapons clashing. The enemy's silence made Amandina's heart sink. It meant that they were well prepared, and there was no need to bluff. This was a premeditated ambush. She opened the drawer under the seat and took out a small cane. At this time the door of the carriage was opened, and a white lion knight stood outside. The situation seemed to be as bad as she had expected. The knight looked anxious and said, "Miss Amandina, please come with me, we will cover your escape." Amandina nodded and jumped off the carriage quickly. She looked back and saw a large number of gray-robed swordsmen coming out of the forest from another direction. The White Lion Guards were retreating because of the lack of manpower, and there seemed to be crossbowmen in the dark. But before she could see clearly, the knight grabbed her hand and dragged her to the side of the forest. The three of them panicked in the forest and didn't dare to stop for a moment. They climbed up the nearest hill in one go. When they looked back, the forest in the distance had already quieted down. But this was not necessarily a good thing. At this time, the two knights in front suddenly stopped and said with surprise, "Miss Jana." Amandina looked in that direction, panting, and was surprised to see the mercenary leader alone in the forest, looking at them with a smile. The two knights beside her subconsciously wanted to go up to her, but she had a bad feeling and hurriedly shouted, "Wait, don't go. Miss Amandina, that's not an illusion, One of the knights turned around to explain, but before he could finish, he groaned and was shocked to see the bloody tip of a sword piercing his chest. The other knight who walked forward also fell to the ground with his eyes open, his head twisted in the hands of a tall cultist. The two cultists looked back at Yuta, but Yuta did not look at them and replied, "What are you still doing here? Go and get rid of him." The two cultists bowed respectfully and left with the corpse. Yuta came to Amandina's side with a smile. She gently lifted Amandina's delicate white chin with her finger and said, "Long time no see, my dear Miss Amandina. I said I would remember you." Amandina looked at this person hatefully. The mercenary leader's eyes were obviously a ring of golden flames. Although her expression was frivolous, there was some dullness in the depths of her eyes. She panted slightly and replied, "You have already controlled Miss Yuta 3 years ago. When you realized that the assaults might fail, you had already abandoned them and arranged another chess piece." "Aha, you guessed right. You also let these people in." Amandina frowned and asked, "But I'm curious, you have been sick for 3 years. How did you arrange these people to enter Tanajil without me knowing?" Yuta smiled happily. "I am a Roman, I am the mistress of this place." "My dear Amandina, don't you remember this fact?" "You are not a Roman at all." Amandina replied word by word. "Don't play your tricks in front of me, Twilight Dragon. You are not even 1,000th of the Roman lady. But I understand you are a merchant. You used the Roman lady to prepare a backup plan for Mr. Brando." Yuta smiled and patted her face. "You are all right, but it is meaningless." Amandina struggled. She wanted to say something, but the mercenary leader hit the back of her head hard and she fainted. The wind in the Karsuk highlands carried a faint smell of blood. It was said that it was the smell of the blood of the heroes who had dried up on this land for thousands of years. Now the wind rose again, and the descendants of the heroes once again picked up the weapons in their hands. But this time the enemies they faced were no longer the undead. The line on the horizon was becoming more and more obvious. It seemed to reflect the sun, revealing a faint purple luster. The crystal cluster lords stopped in the midst of the crystal creatures and raised their heads to release high-frequency sound waves. This ear-piercing scream was transmitted through the resonating crystal towers on the battlefield. It was like a gust of wind blowing through the sea of purple crystals, and the sea began to ripple. The shaking of the earth was becoming more and more obvious. But in front of them, looking down from the sky, the human alliance had already formed a formation on the highlands. Behind them was the outer wall of the Golden City Citadel. Behind it was a continuous chain of fortresses that extended across the uneven landscape of the Turtle Dove Valley. Pieces of silver banners fluttered with the wind on the highlands, extending beyond the horizon. Following the command, the first row of spearmen had already flattened their spears, and huge tower shields were erected one after another. Pairs of young eyes were hidden behind the large shields. Their brown eyes reflected an uncountable amount of purple light. Their owners were pale faces. Bun-eyed, the leader of the Highland Knight, looked at this scene and sighed with some regret. He also understood that these young people from all over the Arrowan might be full of passion, but passion could not change anything here. These people were just unprepared newbies. He could only hope that the first blow would not come too suddenly. He hoped that these young people could hold on. In the distance, the Highland Knight held the flag in front of the formation and constantly sent back information about the front. The Crystal Cluster Vanguard has left the main formation and is accelerating. Distance of 1,300 meters. Maintain the formation. Distance of 700 meters. Be careful not to let them get close to the city wall and cause damage. Distance of 500 meters. Enter the projectile range. But when the last command was issued, the Silver Elf Forest Songblade Legion on the city wall was making the final preparations. Their commander, an elegant lady Metish's descendant, was watching this scene with narrowed eyes. When the sea of crystal clusters crossed the clear line on the battlefield, the lady raised her slender eyebrows and raised her hand. Elves, my sisters. Everyone carefully checked the stability of the gray crystals on the arrows. Every arrow must be enchanted. Remember, pure projectile attacks have no effect on the crystal clusters. Don't waste your strength. Herald, report the readings. At this time, a human knight took the opportunity to shout. Target Area 4 to Area 7, distance of 700 meters, elevation of 47 meters, wind speed of 40 meters downwind, projectile fire. The Silver Elf commander nodded, bow. Regardless of whether it was the archers of the humans or elves, they all raised the longbows in their hands. There was a flash of light on the city wall. Many people turned their heads. But the first thing they saw was not the dense rise of arrows, but the fleet that suddenly appeared in the clouds. The gloomy dark clouds in the sky suddenly separated. A silver fleet descended from the clouds like a silver light spot. When these floating ships just appeared, their left and right sides were already shooting out roaring cannons. It was like a rain of steel falling from the sky. Countless golden lines connected the sky to the earth. The light of steel and fire plowed through the Crystal Cluster Army's attack. In the roar of explosion, the Crystal Cluster Vanguard at the front was directly disintegrated and defeated. The Tanajul people had arrived. A green light fell from the sky and landed in the middle of the battlefield. Huge roots swept in all directions and fell heavily on the ground. At that moment, tens of thousands of crystal clusters turned into ashes. The attacking vanguard was almost completely destroyed. Everyone held their breath and looked up at the giant tree that suddenly appeared on the battlefield. It covered the sky and the sun verdant like a dream. Valhalla! Monica's voice resounded throughout the battlefield. Arrival! The silver elf lady also looked up at the scene and then waved her hand vigorously. Release! A faint voice came from the wind. Buzz! A dazzling light spot rose against the wind. Those were the enchanted arrows. This storm drew an elegant arc in the sky above the battlefield. Like a rainstorm, it fell into the Crystal Cluster Army. In an instant, continuous flashes of light shone on the plateau. The violent explosion tore the weaker crystal clusters into pieces. The momentum of the attack was stopped. But before people could cheer, after the smoke dispersed, the main force of the Crystal Cluster Army appeared behind the thick fog, the heavy crystal bees. For these heavy crystal bees at the back, their numbers were so shocking that the explosion of the gray crystal bees did not have any impact at all. The wreckage piled up like a mountain in front was pushed away by the crystal bees at the back. They continued to move forward like waves. With a sharp whistle, these huge monsters had already begun to speed up and crash into the Human Alliance army. The ground shook violently. A thin layer of smoke could be seen rising from the dry dust a mile away. The formation of the Alliance army was subconsciously affected. Some places even began to retreat. This made the commanders very angry. Bunite also frowned. In the sky, Manrik gave the order for the second volley with a gloomy face. The magic and artillery roared again. From time to time, flashes of light and fireballs rose from the sea of crystal clusters. But it was useless. In the blink of an eye, the Crystal Cluster Army and the Human Alliance Army collided heavily. As soon as they came into contact, the Human Alliance Army began to retreat. After a mere 10 minutes of battle, the two Acropolis were already exposed to the attack of the Crystal Cluster Army. The Tower Mages also joined the battle. But they could not stop the power of the Crystal Cluster Lord. A crystal cluster that was almost as tall as a small mountain climbed up the city wall. It raised its feet and landed heavily. With a loud bang, one side of the Acropolis wall collapsed. The purple sea rushed in. The Acropolis was like a piece of driftwood on a turbulent sea. In the blink of an eye it disappeared. In the direction of Gold City, a silver elf lord with a face full of hardships looked at this scene expressionlessly. Behind him, on top of the city wall, the elves were gathering. One by one, silver dragons appeared in the vision of the elves. Lord Norn, an elf knight wearing a pointed silver helmet and silver scale armor, came to his side. He bowed respectfully and replied, "The knights are ready. They can attack at any time." The elf nodded, took off his cloak and walked back. He took a golden helmet from his attendant. He put on the helmet and pulled down the metal visor. Only a pair of sharp eyes could be seen. On the helmet, a sculpture of a golden dragon with its wings spread stood with its head held high. Norn raised his head and said casually, "Gather, Dragon King's knights." A long and melodious sound of a horn was heard. Countless dragons flew up, covering the sky and covering the earth. On top of the Acropolis wall, Freya was looking at the direction of the battlefield for a long time. She saw the silver dragons cutting through the formation of the Crystal Cluster Army like sharp blades. Especially the commander. He had single-handedly killed the Crystal Cluster Lord that was as big as a mountain, and his personal guards were all extraordinary as well. The situation on the battlefield began to reverse with the addition of the Dragon King's knights. "That's Lord Norn, the legendary hero of the Silver Elves for 1,000 years. Allium Japonicum's voice came from behind her. He also participated in the War of the Holy Saints as a Dragon King's knight. He used to be Medicia's subordinate." "I'm thinking," Freya replied softly, "have they been fighting the Twilight for 1,000 years? Allium Japonicum nodded. "Maybe. That's the Silver Folk. Each of them is so much stronger than us." Freya sighed. "And the dragons? Even they have been defeated by the Twilight. Now that the Twilight Dragon is about to awaken, can we really defeat it? Do you believe in Brando? What about you?" Freya looked at her strangely. Brando had already told them about Allium Japonicum's origin, but compared to Brando's own bizarre experience it seemed to be nothing. But when she thought of Brando's past memories with this woman, she could not help but be curious. "Allium Japonicum, you should know more about Brando, don't you?" "I know Sophie." Allium Japonicum smiled. "I smell something wrong." Freya blushed and touched the ring on her finger subconsciously. "I believe in Brando, but I don't know how much we will have to pay for it." Allium Japonicum shook her head and said nothing. Freya also unbuttoned her cloak and walked down the city wall. "Where are you going?" Allium Japonicum looked at her curiously. Freya turned around and answered seriously, "But no matter what, any price is worth it. The Crystal Cluster's attack has been stopped, now it's our turn to counterattack." As if in response to the Silver Elf's horn, the Human Alliance also sounded a horn. That was the horn for a counterattack. A group of White Lion Knights appeared in the center of the alliance. That was the spearhead of the counterattack. Freya walked in front of everyone in her silver armor. The White Lion's battle robe was draped over her body. She did not ride a horse. The White Lion Guards were the elite walking knight on this continent. Not to mention, with the combined efforts of Brando, Tamar, Amandina, and the Cloud Giant, the strength of this army had been reborn, and it was even far stronger than in King Eric's era. The alliance was silent for a moment. Everyone turned around and looked at the Valkyrie of Erewhon. Although she might still be a little inexperienced, she had already made a name for herself in the past battles. Even the female sword saint of the Kurlutz Empire, the head of the Azure Army, was full of praise for her. Now, not only was she a sword saint herself, her military accomplishments had far surpassed her teachers. In many people's hearts, she was the Erewhon's Darius of this era. Freya did not say much. At this point there was no need for words. Everyone's heart was surging with excitement and their blood was boiling. Everyone should understand what kind of war this was. She unsheathed her sword with a clang and pointed the shiny tip of the sword forward. The White Lion Knights understood their direction. They attacked forward and broke through the enemy's main formation. Their goal was the resonant crystal tower in the middle of the Crystal Cluster army. Chapter 1537. One or two arcs of light streaked across the sky above the battlefield, and the brilliance of magic intertwined with each other. Occasionally, stray arrows would hit the towering resonant crystal tower, and the brilliance of the explosion outlined a hemispherical network. In the cloudy sky, the Sorcerer King in a purple robe stared at the huge black sphere in the middle of the battlefield with a solemn expression. It was the passage through which the goddess of the dead moon had teleported to this world. At this moment, 7 or 8 light portals opened one by one beside him, and a few craftsman sorcerers walked out. The crystal clusters in the distance discovered the enemies in this direction, and flew over with a sharp whistle. Beside him, Tullman looked over, and his eyes flashed with silver light. He opened his 5 fingers, and under the outline of the lines of law, countless transparent rectangles appeared in the air. The crystal clusters could not retract in time and crashed into these intertwined spaces. Like bursting fireworks, they were smashed into pieces. Tullman turned to look at the center of the battlefield and said, "The Kurlutzians have encountered the Blue Calamity in Al-Kash. Ajani has sent back news, but there is still no sign of the king of the non-race and the crystal tyrant." Solomon nodded. Tullman said, "The Twilight Dragon may have other plans, but we can't care so much anymore. We only have so little strength, and being timid will only make things worse. I think at least for now we have to stand on the offensive. The sooner we take action, the more we can deal with the situation." He raised his silver eyebrows and said, "The mortals are more experienced. After 3 years of war, the weakness of the crystal clusters has also been exposed to us. Lady Freya's judgment is very accurate. Look, the crystal cluster's formation has begun to loosen. But it may not let us do as we wish," Solomon replied quietly. They looked at each other without saying anything. Tullman was also confused. The Twilight Dragon had been restraining himself until today, but it started this war before awakening. It must have its own preparations. But it had made a mistake once in the wilderness of 4 realms. How could the Twilight Dragon let the goddess of the dead moon make the same mistake again? But the scene in front of them was exactly the same as that day. Could it be that the Twilight Dragon did not care about Won's strength at all, and only used Tiamat's strength as cannon fodder? A moment later, more doors of light opened in the dark sky. From the ground they looked like shining fish scales. More and more figures walked out from the shining scales. Hundreds and thousands of wizards had appeared in the sky. The Tonajal and Buga fleets were also on the move, constantly drawing closer with banners. At the same time, the floating battleships didn't stop firing at all. The cannons roared, and the light of magic intersected with each other. The light of explosions lit up the crystal clouds, and the monsters that couldn't afford to lose fell like raindrops. This seemed to be the first time the power of order had suppressed the power of dusk. At this moment, the roles of offense and defense in the sky had changed. However, the bright light shone on the faces of Solomon and Tullman. Neither of the 2 adept leaders looked relaxed. A high-grade magus wearing a silver robe came to the 2 of them and replied respectfully, "Sirs, everything is ready to continue. As long as we are within shooting range, we can attack the portal." "Where are the dragons?" Lady Mithril also sent the same message. Tullman turned back to look at Solomon. Although Solomon frowned, he understood that the battlefield was not a place to hesitate. He nodded silently. On the plateau, in the turbulent purple waves, a silver flag was going against the current. Freya raised the silver swallowtail flag in her hand. Not far away, A huge crystal cluster was rushing towards her. The monster's crystal eyes reflected a cold light, and a pair of chelicerae were raised high and stabbed downwards. However, Freya leaped lightly and used the force of its forelimbs to jump to its back. When she flipped her body in midair, she slashed the monster's neck. In the silver light, the crystal cluster's head was separated from its body, and it fell to the ground with a loud bang. She stood steadily on the huge wreckage of the crystal cluster and looked up. In front of her was another huge purple wave. However, Freya's expression was calm as usual. She clenched the flag in her hand and shouted, "White Lion Legion!" The White Lion Knights stood still, sheathed their swords, and pulled out their two-handed swords from their backs. The reflection of the swords reflected a snowy silver light, and the two-handed swords flew up from the bottom, forming a bright forest of swords. Freya gently threw the spear with the flag in her hand and threw it forward. A ray of silver light flashed, and a crystal cluster immediately fell to the ground. She switched the sword in her left hand to her right hand, pointed the sword forward and roared, "Charge!" The White Lion Knights took a step forward in unison. Every line of law on the third-generation wind armor became brighter. The White Lion main cloak was like a pair of snow-white wings. The mask of the wing helmet was pulled down one by one, and only two shining eyes could be seen. With just one step, more than 1,700 sacred runes were imprinted on the dry and cracked ground of the plateau. More than 1,000 pairs of mithril boots stomped on the ground at the same time. And the next step was a surging white wave. As far as the eye could see, it was a sea of silver. It was the charge of the sacred white lions. Just like the reenactment of 700 years ago, Freya's figure seemed to gradually merge with the commander of the White Lion Legion. On the battlefield, for the first time, the uniform drumbeat completely overshadowed the advance of the Crystal Cluster army. The White Lion Knights were attacking. Even the Human Alliance, the Lion people from the Great Plains, Silver Bay, and Toquinen, looked up in surprise. Kill! At the moment when they collided with the crystal clusters, the knights roared and swung the giant swords in their hands upward. The purple crystal wall in front of them collapsed and turned into dust. On the battlefield, the humans and the Dusk army clashed. Some knights fell, but more of the crystal clusters were defeated. The White Lion Knight was like a sharp dagger that pierced the heart of the crystal cluster army. Freya pulled out the flag spear from the corpse of a crystal cluster and looked up. The crystal tower was right in front of her. The formation of the crystal clusters began to become chaotic. They instinctively wanted to return to the crystal tower. The lower crystal clusters had no intelligence, and the crystal tower was the only way for the upper crystal clusters to control the crystal cluster army. The humans had also discovered this secret in the Long War. The crystal tower was the only weakness of the crystal cluster army. Of course, this was only for the lower crystal clusters. The chaos of the crystal clusters further divided the overall attack of the Dusk army, and the battlefield began to become a mess. When the front and back of the Dusk army could not take care of each other, the Highland Knight and the other commanders of the Human Alliance finally saw the light of victory. The long sound of the horn began to rise and fall, and the real counterattack began. Silver dragons were flying across the battlefield at a low altitude. Lord Norn's sharp eyes under the golden helmet carefully scanned the entire battlefield. The Dragon King's Knight's current mission was to besiege the crystal cluster lords that would cause trouble for the mortal army. He looked up and saw that on the other side of the battlefield, in the direction of Dylingia, the Earth Army, a huge army formed by heroic spirits, was also ready to launch the final blow to the crystal cluster army. At least on the first day of the battle, it seemed that they were going to win. However, this experienced Silver Elf commander vaguely felt that there was trouble. There were too few upper battle forces in the Dusk army. On the battlefield on the ground, Freya also frowned. Brando had told her about the division of the power level of the Dusk army. Among the crystal clusters, the weakest were the lower crystal clusters at the bottom. Their power was uneven, and the weakest could only be compared to the lower silver humans, but the strongest could be elemental activation or even elemental enlightenment. Then there was the middle class, the slightly more powerful crystal cluster lords. They were the rulers of various broken worlds in the chaos. Even the weakest of them was above the supreme class. There were even quite a number of sages and great sages, the pinnacle of sages. However, these levels of power seemed to be similar to the mortal world. The real power of the crystal clusters was reflected in their top level. In addition to the tyrant Astoni, who had the power equivalent to the dragon of war Tiamat, there were 22 other high-ranking lords. Even though more than half of these high-ranking lords had fallen in the wars of the past few eras, the remaining 5 were close to the existence of gods in this era. Fala the Orator, Tas the Scorner, Arak the Formless, Fitztom the Black King, Gorgalon the Giant Throat. In the war to recover Cruz, the coalition forces had once fought with the legendary crystal cluster worm Gorgalon at Cloak Bay. With the help of the Bugas and the giant dragon, they repelled the high-level lord, but they were unable to kill it. The power of the crystal clusters in that battle had left a deep impression on her. And on this battlefield, none of these high-level lords had appeared. And even the number of crystal cluster lords was so small. She suddenly stopped. 100 feet, the last charge. Her adjutant was in the midst of shouting orders, and did not even notice that a charging knight had bumped into her from behind. Freya raised her head subconsciously, the silver swallowtail flag in her hand fluttering high, slightly tattered. Above the gloomy sky, 2 fleets were converging. The Bugas had gradually approached the center of the battlefield. Solomon used spatial magic over and over again to explore the surroundings. He used 4 or 5 spells in a row, but the response made him frown. Whether it was space, magic, energy flow, or the network of laws, there was no abnormality at all. Even the Sea of Chaos itself seemed very calm. But this did not make sense. The Twilight Dragon would not only set up a camouflage here. Tullman also patiently asked his adjutant, Alkash, over and over again for news on the battlefield, but the news from thousands of miles away was also a little suffocatingly calm. The people of Cruz also had the advantage on their battlefield. The portal opened by the Blue Calamity in the material world was suppressed by Ajani and their Antar, and the undead army of Madara directly had the upper hand in the face of the crystal cluster. It was said that the strength of the undead army surprised everyone, and a few of the young geniuses among them had even led the Twilight army into a mess. Solomon and Tullman could not help but look at each other. The 2 most powerful wizards could not help but look at each other in the face of this strange situation. Could it be that the Twilight Dragon was really dedicated to fighting for the throne of destiny, and did not care about the outcome of the war in the material world? But at this time the crystal ball in Solomon's hand lit up. It was a message from William. There were only 4 words on it. Be careful, illusion. Solomon stared blankly, but Tullman immediately asked, what kind of illusion can evade spatial detection? The words on the crystal ball floated, and the message changed again. The Eye of Truth. Solomon and Tullman's face changed dramatically at the same time. In this world there was only one kind of illusion that could avoid the eyes of wizards, and that was the power of a real artifact. But every artifact came from the network of Tiamat, and was made by the gods of ancient times. Among them there was only one artifact that was specially made for illusion and prophecy spells, and that was Sasard's omniscient eye, the Eye of Truth. Before Solomon could shout the word retreat, suddenly, a bright flash of light flashed in the northern sky. The light was so dazzling that it attracted the attention of everyone on the plateau within a few hundred miles. The silver elves on the city wall, the defenders of Valhalla, Breton, Manrique, Haruz, and even Her Royal Highness, the Highland Knight, all raised their heads to look at this terrible scene. In the sky, on the flank of the Order Coalition army, the Buga fleet suddenly burst into flames. More than 100 floating warships disintegrated in the air, emitting a dazzling light of explosion, and fell to the plateau with long trails. In just a moment the Buga fleet completely collapsed, and the remaining floating warships also scattered and fled. The disintegration of their formation once again made the entire battle line in the sky even more chaotic. And in that direction, one after another, gigantic figures suddenly appeared. A diamond-shaped crystal behemoth stretched across the sky. Its body was almost like a crystal layer, and it only had one eye in the center of the crystal prism. At this moment, this eye was flickering with a strange light as it stared at the silver fleet in the sky. Every few seconds, a floating warship would burst into flames and explode under its gaze. Black King Fitztom, the most powerful of the High Lords of the Crystal Cluster, and beside him, Fala the Orator, Tas the Despiser, and Arak the Formless revealed themselves one by one. Only Gorgalon the Giant Throat was absent. Perhaps it was because it was too badly injured in the last war, so it did not appear. But just these 4 high lords were enough to make the whole of Wone tremble, because this was an era where the gods were no longer around. No, it could not be said that they were no longer around because the portal of the goddess of the dead moon had obviously reached the final stage. Everyone saw a huge eyeball open in the black sphere. Under the protection of the 4 high lords, the former king of wizards of Sassard, the traitor of the Silver Alliance, the black yen of assassin was wearing the robe of a great wizard. He held the eye of truth in his hand and looked at his former colleagues proudly, and spoke in a strange tone. "Long time no see, Solomon. You don't think I have forgotten the dead of Sassard, do you?" Solomon looked at this person with a dark expression. Oh. Chapter 1538. Amandina couldn't help but shiver as the howling wind blew against her face. Although the winter in Tanajil was already very cold, it was nothing compared to this place. The cold wind was like a knife that cut through a person's skin. It could penetrate deep into the bone marrow and freeze the soul. A layer of frost instantly formed on her long eyelashes. The hot air she exhaled turned into a white mist that blended into the dense fog around her. After Yuta brought her through the door of light, she stopped and looked at the place with a calm expression. As far as her eyes could see, it was a world of ice and snow. There seemed to be a crisscrossing glacier in the distance. Icicles and icicles hung under the broken rocks. The wind whistled, but it could not blow away the fog. The fog surged as if it was a living monster. Yuta did not feel the cold at all. She turned around and asked with a smile, "Do you know where this place is?" Amandina shook her head as she looked at Brendel. Yuta smiled. "This is the country of fog." "Country of fog?" "Mortals also call it the country of ice." Yuta looked at the vast expanse of white ice and raised her hand to catch a snowflake. The snowflake disappeared in her hand. "It is above the dust world and the shadow world, but it is still a part of the lower realm. The country of fog controls the law of the cold. The snowflakes floating in the sky are not real ice and snow, but the reflection of the shallow sea." She pointed above her head. "That is the shallow sea." Amandina raised her head. She could only see a misty scene. She could not even see the existence of the sky. Yuta seemed to be very amused by her behavior and joked, "You can't see that. The country of fog and the water elemental plane are 2 different worlds. Because of the lack of law, you can't see the shallow sea here. You can only see ice and snow." "Is the seat of destiny here?" Amandina asked. Yuta shook her head. "I guess Martha placed it in the birthplace of everything." "The birthplace of everything?" "Light floats in the water, and spirits are born from the water. That is the birthplace of everything in your world, and also the place where she awakened." Yuta, or the Twilight Dragon, replied, "But for many generations I have never found that place. It is as if that place never existed." "Even you can't find something, Twilight Dragon?" "This is normal, because I lack the most important key. With my identity, it is impossible for me to obtain the recognition of the 7 holy swords." Yuta replied indifferently. Amandina was silent for a moment before she asked, "The birthplace of everything is here?" Janna shook her head again. "I think its entrance is in the country of the dead, the dark elemental plane." "Then why did you bring me here?" Janna turned back to look at her. "Because Helm's underworld is indeed connected to the Misty Kingdom. We took such a big detour to avoid alerting Marcia." "Lady Martha?" Yuta took out a dagger from its sheath and gently cut a wound on her hand as if she did not feel any pain. She turned her hand and let the blood drip onto the snow. Strangely enough, the blood flowing from her wrist did not seem to coagulate at all in such cold weather. It dripped onto the white snow bit by bit. Amandina's eyes flashed with a golden light. She focused on her bleeding and replied softly, "After 7 generations of war, we are all too familiar with each other. I think she might have guessed that I would follow her here. What happened in stagnation taught me a lesson. That woman is not easy to deal with." Amandina frowned. "What are you doing?" Yuta did not answer the question. She walked forward step by step in the snow and used her blood to draw a circle. The blood in the circle squirmed as if it was given life and moved closer to the center, gradually connecting with each other. When Amandina saw this scene, she suddenly understood what she was planning. She suddenly struggled to her feet and rushed over to stop Yuta's actions. Amandina took a step back, her sword appearing in her left hand at some point. She held the hilt of the sword and swung the scabbard heavily at Amandina's lower abdomen. Amandina only felt her stomach churn, and she fell to her knees in the snow. Yuta looked at her and said with a smile, "Your goddess has set up layers of barriers in Tanajal. Even if I use the black moon to fall, I cannot penetrate this land protected by the 7 holy relics. But the so-called unconquerable fortress often disintegrates from the inside. You see, what you are doing now is just a waste of effort." Amandina frowned in pain and almost broke her silver teeth. She knelt in the cold snow and looked at Amandina hatefully without saying a word. The blood in the snow began to glow little by little. The mess left behind by the last celebration a few days ago was gradually covered by the wind and snow. The city of Daelanji was dead silent. The men had already put on their armor and picked up their weapons to fight to the death with the dusk. There was only a desolation left on the streets, and there were a few tattered curtains fluttering in the wind in the square. The light of magic lit up the sky from time to time, and the sound of explosions came one after another. The whole city seemed to be trembling. But in the lonely street, there was a girl walking in the snow. The whistling cold wind did not seem to be able to stop her exuberant spirits. She was wearing a leather skirt common to traders in the Grimoires area. She carried a bag in her hands clasped behind her back. She kicked the snowflakes in the street with her round-toed shoes with great interest, as if she were still innocent, and looked curiously at the scenery around her. "Where is this place? Why did I come here?" The young girl muttered to herself, as if she was talking to someone. But all of a sudden she stopped in her tracks. There was a shop in front of her. The eaves of the shop were half tilted due to the accumulated snow, and the furnishings inside looked like a grocery store. It was dim, and there was only one candle. But at least this was the only shop on the street that was still open. The owner was a middle-aged man, and he was limping inside the shop. There was no one in the city, and he did not have any business. It seemed that he was preparing to close the shop, but when he turned around he saw the girl standing in front of his shop. The man was stunned. There was a conspicuous scar on his face, and it looked a little sinister under the dim light. His legs seemed to be injured, and it was difficult for him to walk. He looked at the girl in confusion and asked, "Which family are you from? Where's your family? Why haven't you run away?" The girl tilted her head and replied, "I don't have a family. By the way, my name is Roman. Uncle, you haven't left yet, right?" The man smiled bitterly. "Do you think I can leave like this? Anyway, my life is worthless, and the worst that can happen is that I die here. You, on the other hand, are just a child. It's a pity to stay here." As he spoke, he struggled to move his body, allowing Roman to walk into the shop. Romaine curiously looked at the furnishings in the shop. She felt a sense of familiarity in her heart. It was as if she remembered the time when she was bargaining with others in a shop like this. There was also a frowning young man standing next to her. But those memories were vague and distant, and even she did not know what was true and what was false. "Forget it, let's not talk about those unlucky things. Little girl, what do you want to buy?" The man limped to the counter and asked. Roman's gaze fell on an old sugar jar on the shelf. It was a beautiful glass jar filled with colorful candy wrappers, but the surface was a little mottled. The lid was still intact, and it was fastened with a golden buckle. It was like a dream that reflected the past. She looked at the jar and was in a daze for a while. "Brando, I want that sugar jar. But we don't have that much money. When we have money in the future I must buy it. By the way, why don't we borrow some from Freya?" "Don't even think about it." The man followed her gaze, pointed at the candy jar and asked, "You want this?" He looked at the sugar jar and gently picked it up, revealing a nostalgic expression. "This is my birthday gift to my daughter." "Birthday gift?" The man nodded silently. "Your daughter? She died during the First War of the Black Roses." "The First War of the Black Roses?" Roman blinked slowly. "What?" She gently shook her head. "What a terrible war. It was not easy for me to escape at that time." This sentence actually caused the middle-aged man to be in a daze for a while. After a long time he finally replied, "Yes, if she could escape at that time, she would be almost as old as you. Can you sell it to me?" The man silently looked at the sugar jar and nodded. "If you like it." The merchant girl dug into her purse, but could not help but look up with a little embarrassment. Can I buy it on credit? My money was taken by that evil woman. The man looked at the girl with a dumbfounded expression. Can't I? He helplessly shook his head and put the sugar jar in front of her with a bitter smile. Speaking of which, what's the use of money at this time? If this thing can satisfy you, then it's enough. Roman held the sugar jar with both hands and nodded. I will take good care of it. As she spoke, she looked at the snow outside and slightly frowned. Are you going back, little girl? The man suddenly asked. Where is your home? Do you want me to send you back? Roman nodded, then shook her head. I don't have a home, she replied. But I really have to go, that evil woman is calling for me. Evil woman? Roman smiled sweetly at him. Then she gently took a step forward, as if a door of light had opened in front of her, allowing the merchant girl to step in. In just a blink of an eye, the girl and the sugar jar in her hands disappeared without a trace. The middle-aged man stood there dumbfounded, unable to move for a long time. Yuta slowly closed her eyes, and the golden light in her eyes gradually faded. She stared at the magic circle, and the light in it became brighter and brighter. Suddenly, a black door of light gradually opened. Roman gently walked out with the sugar jar in her hands, stepping on the soft snow, but it did not let her sink half an inch. She looked at Amandina with some surprise. Amandina, why are you here? Roman. Amandina looked at the merchant girl in shock. You changed back. Roman's expression became serious and she sneered. Of course not. Then under Amandina's stunned gaze, she casually threw the sugar jar in her hand. The glass jar rolled twice in the snow, and the two lids were knocked open. The sugar wrappers in the jar suddenly flew with the cold wind and fell to the ground. Roman heaved a sigh of relief and said, this body is getting worse and worse. She turned around and looked at Jana. The female mercenary leader had already fainted due to excessive blood loss. She then turned back and smiled. How about it, I still came here. Did you really think that I let the Sassolds cause internal strife in Erewhon for nothing? Although that dog is a little stupid, it still has some use. The Twilight Dragon stared into Amandina's eyes, and under her intense gaze, Amandina only felt her vision darken, and beads of sweat seeped out of her forehead. She panted slightly and replied with difficulty. You bewitched the Sassolds? To cause internal strife in Erewhon just for this purpose? Roman shook her head. That's not necessarily the case, but my original body hasn't awakened yet. If you didn't act so quickly, I wouldn't have to go through so much trouble. What do you want to do? I already knew that the beacon was in that guy's hands, but it doesn't matter. Just think of it as him leading the way for me. But you are more important, my dear Amandina. There can be many beacons, but there is only one key. Don't even think about it. Amandina suddenly widened her eyes. This was because the merchant girl's face was almost touching hers as she stared into her eyes. Under Roman's long eyelashes, her beautiful eyes stared into Amandina's gaze without blinking. The Twilight Dragon opened her mouth slightly and exhaled, saying, That's not necessarily true, my dear Amandina. Have you forgotten we are friends? Two golden lights pierced into the depths of Amandina's heart, and in a moment, Amandina fell heavily to the ground. Roman smiled and clapped her hands. She looked at the sleeping Amandina with satisfaction and slowly came to the edge of the broken glacier. Another strange sound came from the biting cold wind. All of a sudden, a mountain-sized crystal claw rose from the bottom of the cliff and grabbed the edge of the cliff. A giant beast was slowly revealing its entire body. Compared to it, Amandina, who was standing at the edge of the glacier, was as small as a grain of sand. But in front of Roman, the crystal behemoth slowly lowered its head. The Twilight Dragon looked at her subordinate with a smile and said softly, Astoni, after thousands of years of waiting, are you impatient? The Crystal King let out a low roar. Don't worry, she replied with a smile, at the same time pointing at Amandina and Yuta. Bring them. Astoni, the king of crystal clusters, looked at her in confusion. What, you even dare to disobey my orders? Astoni replied in a low voice and stepped back slightly to show her submission. She raised her claw, and a circle of invisible ripples appeared in the air. Dark magic surged up from the sea of elements, lifting Amandina and Yuta and placing them in her palm. Protect them, the Twilight Dragon replied. Especially the little girl, they are still useful to me. Astoni nodded. Oh. Chapter 1539. After a loud noise, the rusty anchor flew out of the skeleton's hand, dragging the long iron chain behind it as it flew towards Brando. However, a silver light flashed in Brando's eyes, and under the guidance of the lines of law, it slightly deviated from its original trajectory and landed heavily on the ground. Brando immediately jumped up and pulled the iron chain in midair. His godlike strength was not inferior to the mythical King of Bones, and it staggered forward. Brando grabbed the iron chain and used it as leverage again. The flash strike sword art followed like a shadow and stabbed towards the huge skeleton. A straight and bright line seemed to be produced in the darkness. The phosphorescence in Gudmod's eyes flashed, and it raised its claws to grab the line. The grayish-white lines of law in the space bent and revealed the trace of the sword in Brando's hand. With a soft sound, the skeleton's giant hand actually firmly grasped the blade of the holy sword Odorfice. It missed. Brando's heart flashed with a trace of surprise. It was not that his flash strike sword art had never missed, but it was the first time that it was directly seen through by the skeleton. He could not help but admire the strength of the skeleton's soul. The soul element could drive the lines of law to penetrate space to sense the attacker's location. Yes, Brando had realized that the skeleton was not sensing the sword in his hand, but him holding the sword. Even if the soul element of this level did not reach the height of the power of existence, it had at least touched the highest level of elemental kingdom. It was worthy of being the legendary bridgekeeper of the Bridge of the Dead, an undead with divinity. He did not hesitate to let go of the sword in his hand and moved to the side. It looked as if he was letting the huge skeleton take the holy sword Odorfice. This action even startled Gudmod. It raised its head, and the two pale phosphorescents in its eye sockets were almost the size of a lantern, one bright and one dark. If it could see, then what it saw must be an illusion mixed in the shadows, holding a long sword that was slowly taking shape in front of it. But unfortunately, the skeleton could not see anything, and it could only sense the existence of the soul. Without any soul ripples, the 9 luminary sword arts phantom held Cinna in his hand and disappeared in a flash. With a single slash he broke 7 of its ribs. The King of Bones let out a mournful wail, stood up abruptly, and pulled back the anchor. The anchor swept towards Brando, but the latter did not even look at it. With a cold face, he punched the anchor with a backhand. With a hum, iron anchor straightened its chain and flew back to wrap around the neck of the huge skeleton several times. The huge inertia caused the divine undead to lose its balance and fall back. The holy sword Odorfice that it was holding tightly also flew out of its hand. Brando raised his head and took the holy sword. At the same time, he took a big stride forward, and Gudmod punched his already shattered chest. In a series of bone-cracking sounds, almost half of the King of Bones' body exploded and fell back completely. But Brando quickly grabbed the broken chain of the anchor and pulled it back. In the eyes of ordinary people, the huge body of the divine undead was as light as a rag doll in Brando's hand. It flew back and Brando directly cut it in half. The broken bones scattered all over the ground, and the 2 halves of the King of Bones fell heavily on the ground, kicking up a cloud of dust. This battle of small size to gain a huge advantage stunned Alaz, and she could not help but look at Brando with shining eyes. This was a real battle of gods. Although the King of Bones, Gudmod, was not a real god, it was at least a demigod existence. Although it was so weak in front of Brando, if it was in the mortal world, even the top existence among the Bugas, their spells would have a hard time hurting this divine undead. Every punch of Brendel's was imbued with the power of time and space. It could be said that every punch tore apart Gudmod's soul essence in extreme plane. The power of the soul was so weak that it could not even withstand a single blow from the absolute control of time and space. What was absolute power? This was absolute power. But Brando did not relax at all. He turned around and shouted, "The Shire! Found it, my lord!" The Shire's eyes were flashing with a bright blue light. He was using the spell of future foresight to filter the cards in his deck of cards of fate. Page after page of cards in his eyes, he finally found the one he was looking for. At this time, the lantern in Gudmod's hand lit up. It was already the 7th or 8th time it had used this ability. As long as the light of this undead divine artifact shone on its body, all injuries would be healed. The Shire displayed his spell. Ineffective, destroyed target artifact or enchantment. You gain 10% of your mana. The lines of law in the space lit up layer by layer. With a cracking sound, the lantern in Gudmod's hand dimmed. The huge undead wailed. The phosphorescence in its eyes dissipated bit by bit. Its entire body seemed to have lost the power that held it together. With a loud bang, it broke apart and scattered on the ground. The Shire stepped forward and kicked its huge skull, kicking it into the abyss. Good thing you finally found it. Brando wiped the sacred sword Odorfice and said in an annoyed tone, "Otherwise, I'm afraid we'll have to fight another 70 or 80 rounds with this damned undead here. When we get back to Wonde, we'll just have to collect the corpses of the others." "My lord, the spell of card filtering doesn't always work. It's your fault for being so unlucky." "Who's unlucky?" The Shire quickly shrugged and changed the topic. "Don't Fenice and Minocha also have spells that can destroy artifacts?" "We don't have the ability to filter cards," the fairy said angrily. Only then did Tia run up from afar. The divine undead were immune to all mortal spells. They were completely useless in such a battle. Unless Medisha could open an enchantment. However, it was clear that Brando did not intend to let everyone give it their all here. The elven girl looked at the scattered bones and could not help but be surprised. "It's dead just like that. Isn't it, Gudmod?" "Gudmod is immortal and indestructible," Medisa replied with a smile. "It's not dead?" Brando walked over and picked up the lantern. There was a long crack on the surface of the lantern, but the crack was obviously slowly healing. "The bridge keeper of the bridge of the dead, the lord of the undead. This is also a curse. It curses it to wander around here for eternity. As long as its divinity is not extinguished, it will not die." He casually threw the lantern into the dust, but Tia ran up and picked it up like it was a treasure. No matter what, it was a divine artifact. Brando raised his head and looked at the fog in the distance. "Let's go. The repose of the dead moon may be in front of us." The repose of the dead moon. It's the holy land of the undead, the place of eternal rest. Mephistopheles replied with some longing. "The undead will sleep here forever, never to remember the mortal world. But they will be truly reborn in the sea of death. Their souls will return to the world tree, and one day they will finally be reborn in this world in another form. The land of eternal death is the final destination of all undead. It is the place where the goddess of the dead moon's divine kingdom, Elodinor, is located." Medisha also replied. But Brando suddenly stopped. More corpses appeared in the fog. It was a dog-like monster the size of a small mountain. Everyone had to look up to see its full appearance. Its body was covered with wounds, and bronze blood flowed out from the wounds, but it had long dried up. Brando saw the color of the blood and could not help but twitch his eyelids. "What is this?" Scarlet asked doubtfully. "The dusk wolf, the offspring of Fenrir? Look at their blood." The deer-bodied demoness reached out and touched the monster's sticky blood. The blood on her finger was a bright copper color. She said, "This is Garm's son." "Garm?" "The doomsday hound in the pale poem, the vanguard of the dusk," Irene replied. "But they are actually not of the dusk tribe, but of the bronze species." Bronze species? This term made everyone's heart tremble. The bronze species was the missing bloodline between the iron and silver species. Legend said that they were the descendants of the giants, one of the last races created by the divine people. They were the only existence in this world that could perfectly accept the authority of Tiamat and absorb nutrients from the dark magic. They were a powerful and perfect race, but unfortunately, they were born bloodthirsty, cruel and warlike. They were created by the gods and abandoned by the gods. They joined the Dusk Dragon and betrayed the Dusk Dragon. It could be said that they were a race with a bad fate. It was no wonder that the divine people called them failed experiments, although Brando himself did not like the name. But perhaps it was also luck in a sense. It was because of the betrayal of the bronze species that the iron people as mortals could appear in this world. Is this the legendary bronze species? Scarlet boldly touched the skin of the offspring of Garm. It was cold to the touch, but she could clearly feel the existence of Tiamat's law. The monsters are their descendants? Brando nodded. But why are there bronze species here? The little female dragon was a little surprised. Shouldn't they have been extinct long ago? This is just a corpse. Flofa pointed out her faulty wording. It doesn't prove that they are not extinct. But I always feel that it's not that simple. Alaz replied solemnly. The battlefield here doesn't seem to be that old. In fact, since the era of Azure, the bronze species have gradually faded out of history. Brando also agreed with this statement. At least in the history he knew, there was no record of the bronze species and the undead fighting. The Bugas recorded that they were gradually wiped out by the divine people and the gods after the War of Azure, and after that, the gods gradually faded out of people's sight. Maybe they have been hiding here all this time? Tia asked. The gods have long passed away, and no one knows what happened in the lower realm, right? This sentence vaguely reminded Brando. But he shook his head, but there was some doubt in his heart. He always felt that he seemed to have thought of something, but whether it was the memory of the previous or the previous life, it seemed to have nothing to do with it. In the Amber Sword, he had never heard of the Bronze Clan. Everyone slowly walked forward. There were more and more corpses in the darkness, but not only the bronze species, but also the crystal clusters and demons. The Shire raised his staff, letting the tip of the staff shine brightly. The light penetrated the floating fog, outlining the mountains of corpses a little further away. There was silence all around, and a few world tree roots pierced through the darkness in the distance, passing through the fog above everyone's head, making the whole space strange and eerie. Everyone quietly looked at the battlefield of unknown era, and the fierceness of the battle was beyond imagination. What was puzzling was that the dusk, the undead, and the bronze species all seemed to belong to different camps, and judging from the state of the corpses, they were fighting each other. This was really too strange. Tia lifted Modgud's soul lamp and pretended to shine it around, but Falerne glanced at her and said coldly, "Throw it away." The little elven girl blinked and looked at her sister pitifully, whispering in a low voice, "This is the Lord's trophy." Falerne looked at Brando coldly, and Brando hurriedly said, "I don't want this thing. Although this lamp is a divine artifact, ordinary people can't use it. By the way, when it's restored, Modgud might come back to life and come looking for you, Tia." Tia was startled and couldn't help but lift the lamp to take a closer look, as if there really was a ghostly fire burning in the lamp. She was so scared that her face turned pale, and she hurriedly put down the lamp, trembling a little as she spoke. I'll put it here, can I? I think you'd better put it back on the bridge, Tia, the Shire replied with a smile. Alone? Tia was about to cry, her legs gave way, and she almost fell to the ground. Fortunately, Ferlin was quick enough to grab hold of her sister. She held Tia's hand and patted her back to comfort her. Then she raised her head and glared at Charles. The Shire shrugged. As for Medisha and Scarlet, they couldn't help but laugh. Alaz looked at the battlefield shrouded in fog and darkness, and the little female dragon's face had a rare solemn expression. What a great battle! For a dragon who inherited knowledge from her bloodline, the silent scene clearly evoked some memories in her heart. It was a great battle. Brando also nodded. The world tree roots gathered here, forming an open plain, and the outline of Eludenir's palace could be seen in the distance. This was the land of eternal rest, where countless corpses slept in the darkness, but none of them were below the level of a lord. The 7 stone slabs in his hand shot out beams of light, occasionally changing direction, but always pointing towards the divine kingdom of the goddess of the fallen moon. In the end, there was no path left, and they could only move forward by stepping on the bones. The sound of bones cracking was terrifying. As Hippamela walked, she gestured with the hammer in her hand. She seemed to have found something interesting and swung it down. The head of the hammer stopped above the head of a white skull on the side of the road. Hippamela proudly raised her chin. But it was at this time that a cracking sound came from the darkness. The priestess was startled. She raised her hammer in confusion, but the white skull was clearly intact. A pair of black eye sockets stared at her motionlessly. Hippamela turned around, and found that everyone was looking up at a nearby mountain of bones. A human skeleton was rolling down from that direction. The Nightsong Tiger and the others immediately prepared for battle, and Scarlet and Medisha also put down their spears. As for Tia, she was already scared into a quail, and hid behind her sister with a pale face, fearing that Mr. Modgud would come for her. A deformed monster appeared on the mountain of bones. Oh! Chapter 1540. When Brando saw the monster, he frowned slightly. It was the son of Garm. It seemed that he had already understood who was the final victor of this tragic war. After the great battle with the Dusk and the undead here, the Bronze race had been dormant in the underworld of Helm for thousands of years. As expected, they did not perish, but Brendel was curious. Did they come here before or after Kleist left her divine kingdom? But Brando could not help but complain about another thing in his heart, and that was how much of the information given by the Bugas was reliable. What kind of nonsense was this guardian of knowledge? Now, he began to wonder if the ancestors of the Sossels had been banished from Ebabel Fortress to the mortal world because they had been banished from the Great Silver Library by the gods. After all, after the Azure War, Babel Fortress had lasted for quite a long time before it officially died of old age. And with this work attitude, it was very possible. Brando and the others looked back, and pairs of green eyes appeared in the darkness, counting from afar thousands of them. Anyone would feel their hair stand on end if they were stared at by so many glowing green eyes, let alone in this strange environment. Medisa, Irene, Scarlet, Andrea and the others subconsciously moved closer to him. The little female dragon and Flora also revealed their dragon wings, protecting the spellcasters in a circle. This was the most direct warning posture of the dragons in human form. But the two pairs of scaled wings, one gold and one silver, were quite beautiful under the faint light. What do we do? The Shire asked in a low voice. What else can we do? Brando had already drawn the holy sword Odorfice from his back, the blade gleaming faintly under the cold light. Of course, the best strategy is to run. But perhaps the son of Garm also understood his words, and with a long howl, the vicious hound on the mountain of bones had already swooped down. That scene was simply shocking. It was as if countless rats were rushing down and converging into a surging torrent. However, unlike the rats, this was a type of monster that was extremely aggressive. 10 meters away, the demon hound Garm had already bared its fangs and pounced over. The Shire stretched out the staff in his hand, and the hound flew back, rolling into a ball with another of its kind behind it. Probably because he felt that this method was very effective, Charles simply muttered something and cast a wall of law in front of him. An invisible ripple spread out, and the demon dogs crashed into it one after another. In the blink of an eye, a thick layer of law was piled up. Seeing this, the others followed suit. Brando threw the light ball in his hand to Tia, and at the same time opened his left and right hands, immediately forming an impassable barrier on the left and right. As for Mephistopheles and Andrique, their soul net was quite useful here. Which way? Charles shouted over his shoulder. Tia! Brendel called out. Huh? Oh! Tia hurriedly looked at the light ball in her hands, and a beam of light shot forward. But just as she was about to cry, the beam of light shone on the belly of the hounds in front of her. Outside the wall of law, the demon hounds had already blocked her view. Although the little girl tried her best to stand on her toes, it was to no avail. She could only anxiously shout, "My lord, I can't see." Brando shook his head and grabbed her by the collar, lifting her up and putting her on his shoulder. Tia's eyes finally lit up and she quickly shouted, "Over there, over there. Speak human language." Brando shouted in annoyance. "There are a lot of palaces over there. It's a Lucinel." Medisa immediately replied. At this time, a fish that had escaped the net drilled through the gaps of the intertwined soul net. The little elf princess stabbed her spear with the back of her hand and pierced through it. Everyone immediately charged towards the divine kingdom of the goddess of the dead moon. Although they were not afraid of these low-level magical creatures with their strength, no one knew how many of them there were here, or even if there was something else behind them. Besides, even if they had the strength to kill all of these things, they did not have that much time. Brando quickly led the others to open up a bloody path, while Irene summoned vines from behind to block the hound's pursuit. The group quickly entered the territory of Lucinel's divine kingdom. Soon, a long flight of stairs appeared in front of them, and the stairs led up to the palace in the fog. That was the stairs of the dead. In the golden age of the divine kingdom, there were countless ghosts wandering the stairs of the dead, and they were all Kleist's subjects. But now the gods had long since passed away, and Kleist, who was controlled by the Twilight Dragon, was just a puppet that had lost the power of the law of Tiamat. Lucinel's divine kingdom had not been visited by outsiders for tens of thousands of years, and as far as the eye could see, it was barren and empty like a dead zone. In the distance, the temple hidden in the dense fog was also a scene of desolation and ruin. Tia sat on Brando's shoulder and looked back, her little face pale. Behind them, the descendants of Garm were still in hot pursuit, rolling in the fog like a gray torrent. What scared her even more was the countless eyes in the darkness, which looked like a galaxy from afar. A descendant of Garm pounced over, and she screamed in fright and threw out a fireball. But not only did the fireball not blow the hound away, it angered even more of the descendants of Garm. Brando looked back and estimated the distance slightly, then pulled out the holy sword Odorfice and swung it back. A golden light suddenly appeared, and the two arcs of the sword were thousands of meters long. It flew over a distance of dozens of feet and landed heavily on the stairs of the dead. After a loud crack and a thunderous roar, the stairs of the dead broke in front of everyone's eyes and fell into the endless abyss. This attack completely blocked the path of Garm's descendants, and countless vicious dogs rolled down the cliff together. Their cries could be heard clearly from miles away. Andrique and Mephistopheles looked at this scene, dumbfounded. The vampire girl even lost her composure and shouted, "Sir, are you crazy? This is the stairs of the dead. This is the sanctuary of Lady Clyce. How can you do this? The goddess will not let you go." Brando glanced at her and said, "Your goddess left here an era ago." "But—" Andrique opened her mouth and her bright lips squirmed, but she could not say anything. She wanted to refute this treacherous person, but she could not produce any strong evidence. At this time, another earth-shattering roar came from the darkness in the distance. It was the sound of a building collapsing. Everyone could not help but look in that direction, and saw that the west side of Eliudiner's divine kingdom in the darkness had suddenly collapsed, and about a third of the area had completely disappeared. "Looks like Clyce has no time to trouble us for the time being." Brando looked in that direction and said. Andrique's face was full of shock and anger. Tia's mouth was wide open. "The goddess is really angry." Before she could finish her sentence, a gigantic head suddenly emerged from behind the cloud of dust. The head was almost as tall as a 3-story building. Its long ears stood up high, and its 2 glowing eyes were like 2 full moons. When it noticed Brando and the others, it opened its mouth and revealed 2 rows of snow-white fangs. It was obviously a canine, or rather a hound from hell. If it was a descendant of Garm, it was obviously many times bigger than the descendant of Garm. The hound shook its head to shake off the dust and pebbles on its body. From a distance of a few miles, some pebbles could be seen flying towards it and landing on the stairs. Then the huge hound gradually stretched its body and slowly stood up. It was like a moving mountain. The Shire could not help but suck in a breath of cold air. "That's Garm's original body, the Doomsday Hound," Medisha added softly. "That's a mythical hound. Are we its match?" the Shire asked. Brando shook his head. Garm's strength was probably on par with Solomon. With the support of the law of Tiamat, he really did not care about this thing. But it was still in existence close to a god. They did not have so much time to waste on this thing. "Mephistopheles, you are an undead. You should be more familiar with the land of eternal rest than we are. Take the others to the sanctuary of the goddess. I don't believe it can even enter the relics of the saint," he said. "The sanctuary of Lady Clyce?" Mephistopheles had never heard such treacherous words in his life. He subconsciously looked at his sister. "But take him there." Andrea, on the other hand, had already calmed down. She glanced at Brendel and replied in a huff, "If the goddess was there, she would have killed this treacherous bastard with one slash. Your goddess may not be my match now." Brando was still in the mood to joke. The vampire lady was so angry that her teeth were chattering. Mephistopheles could only nod helplessly. At this time Garm had completely awakened. The light in its eyes became brighter. It straightened up and jumped lightly to a place very close to them. A temple building collapsed under the hound's stomp. It looked down at Brando and the others in the smoke and dust. Brando felt the ground shaking. He put Tia down and looked up at the behemoth. "You guys go first. I'll hold this thing back." "My lord." Tia's eyes were red. "Don't make it sound like it's a parting of life and death." Brando rolled his eyes. "This thing is no match for me. You guys save me some time." It was only then that everyone understood. Brendel had Ropar stay behind to fight with him, while the others dispersed into the holy temple. But Garm obviously did not intend to let anyone go. When it saw the Mephistopheles moving, it immediately pounced in that direction. "You're courting death." Brando did not expect this thing to ignore him. This stupid dog's brain did not seem to be enough. He raised Odorfice and attacked with Flash Strike Sword Art. A dazzling golden line flashed in the darkness. Garm was alerted and stopped in its tracks. The golden line cut less than 10 feet in front of its claw, and with a dull rumble, the entire holy temple seemed to sink down half an inch along the thin line. It was only then that Garm turned around, his eyes glinting coldly at Brendel. Brando did not talk nonsense with it. His body flashed 3 times in a row, and the holy sword in his hand pointed straight at Garm's head. The Doomsday Hound howled and also swung its claw at Brando. The sword and the claw clashed in midair, creating sparks. Brando was stunned. He did not believe it and slashed 3 more times. The same 3 golden lines swept past and sparks flew. How hard is this thing? This thought flashed through Brando's mind. He had already reached the limit of his strength, and the golden flame holy sword in his hand was supported by the law of space. Yet, the sword only created sparks on the dog's claw? At this moment, Brendel finally had a first-hand understanding of the Bronze Tribe's strength. But it did not matter. If the sword was not enough, there was still the fist. Brando put away his sword and punched directly on the soft flesh of Garm's claw. At that moment, the line of law behind him flashed and disappeared. Garm screamed and the flesh on its palm burst open. This was the so-called big also has a big disadvantage. Although this stupid dog's claw was very hard, not every part of its claw was horny. But even under such circumstances, Garm could still launch a counterattack. With a backhand claw, it swept Brando heavily. The latter flew out like a cannonball and fell into the group of temples in the distance. However, this attack did not make Garm feel better. Instead, it made it even more furious. This was because when it retracted its claw, it found that a part of its hard mane had been burnt, and golden flames were almost seeping out of its claw. In the ruins, Brendel flipped over and stood up. He wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth. The golden patterns on his body burned fiercely and spread all over his body. This was the golden flame holy blood of the Templar Knight, the crown of thorns. With his defense and recovery ability, Garm's claw had injured him at least 10 times more. In other words, if he wanted to, even if he stood here and let Garm attack, he would definitely not be the first to die. But Brendel did not have the time for that. He looked at the furious Garm, shrugged, and walked towards the top of the holy cathedral. Garm's claw had helped him a lot. At least he did not have to run away. As soon as he turned around, Garm let out an angry roar and pounced on him again. Brando had expected that this stupid dog would not give up. He did not even bother to look back and only shouted, "Ropar! Here!" The Fireclaw Lizardman Lord replied. A golden flame suddenly broke out of the dense fog and hit Garm's head. Compensation instant spell. Calculate all damage received in this turn, and deal the same amount of damage to the target creature. If the player has any wrath counters, move all wrath counters. Every time a wrath counter is removed in this way, the same amount of mana cost will be deducted from this card. With an earth-shattering shriek, the pitiful Doomsday Hound tumbled back once again. This time the injury had hurt its tendons and bones, and it could not stand up again for a long time. Ropar expressionlessly extended his hand to Brando. Brando looked up and grinned, firmly grabbing his hand. The Fireclaw Lizardman Lord pulled Brendel up the steps of the holy temple. The two of them looked down at the smoke and dust below, then turned around and walked back, side by side into the center of the kingdom of Eliudenir. In front of them was Klyce's living place, the sanctuary of the dead moon. The others were waiting for the two of them on the platform above the steps. Tia looked down with some doubt and asked, "That big guy won't come after us again?" Brando looked at the two scythe-wielding statues of the Grim Reaper outside the sanctuary of the dead moon and replied, "It can try, but I don't think it has the guts." Sure enough, when Tia looked down at the group of temples below, Garm wandered angrily in the ruins for a while, but in the end did not dare to chase after them. Obviously, this thing had suffered here before. "Look at the beacon, Tia," Brando reminded her. Tia hurriedly took out the ball of light from her sleeve, only to find that a straight ray of light pointed straight into the depths of the temple. Brando was slightly startled. He did not expect that he would hit the jackpot, and the direction of the beacon was actually in the Dead Moon Sanctuary. But he was a little puzzled. Why would the Seat of Destiny be in this place? It did not seem safe here, not to mention that the goddess of the Dead Moon, Cleis, had already become a puppet of dusk. He stopped, only to find that the little female dragon beside him also stopped and looked into the temple. The two of them looked back at each other and saw the confusion in each other's eyes. "What did you think?" Alaz asked softly. "What about you?" "It's the same question as before. Why would the Bronze Clan appear in this place?" The little female dragon's golden eyes flashed with doubt. Did they come here before or after Cleis left her divine kingdom? Did the gods really annihilate them? There is a very important question. She thought for a moment and added, "Don't you think it's strange? The time of the god's death is actually very close to the extinction of the Bronze Clan, around the time of the Battle of Azure." "I didn't think that much," Brando replied. "I just feel a little strange. I feel like I'm very familiar with this place. No, not familiar with the divine kingdom of Alucinare, but there are some hidden things here that make me feel familiar." "Have you been here before?" Alaz asked. Brando slowly shook his head. The group had already walked past the two of them into the temple, but suddenly the Shire in front of them stopped. He turned back and shouted, "My lord, take a look at this one last time." Brando walked over and followed the Shire's gaze. In the middle of the dark hall, a perfect woman sat on the throne. Her long black hair hung from the back of her head all the way to the shiny obsidian, like a waterfall. Her figure was tall like a peerless sculpture. A long reptilian tail extended from under her robe, lazily curled on the ground. But the layers of black silk robe did not add any color to this goddess, because any mortal attire would hinder her majesty. When people saw her, all they could see was her pair of starry eyes. Oh! Chapter 1541. The battlefield was already in a state of chaos. The sky in the north was burning fiercely, and there were streaks of dazzling black smoke hanging in the sky. Scornful Task's mountain-like corpse crawled on the horizon. Its crystal-like body was covered with vines, and a hole filled with cracks pierced through its body. It quietly stared in front of it. There Valhalla's dim crown was slowly regaining its luster. The dazzling pillar of light was like a verdant dream, engraved in the memories of everyone who saw it. The roots of the giant tree were once again inserted into the ground, and the sparkling radiance of magic flowing under the plateau could be seen from dozens of miles away. However, Valhalla had almost withdrawn from the battle. The Crystal Cluster Lord's figure towered into the clouds on the other side of the giant tree, continuously attacking Valhalla's defenses. Every time it collided with the hemispherical net of light, the entire stronghold would shake intensely. The Valkyries had already taken to the sky, riding around Farah and attacking. However, from afar, it looked like a silver light spot beside an amethyst mountain. Tens of thousands of purple light formations suddenly appeared on Farah the Errant's huge body, and beams of purple light shot out from the formations. The Valkyries were instantly drowned in a sea of purple light, and some of them were hit and fell down from time to time. A silver arc suddenly pierced through the sea of purple light. Tulman had finally completed his spell, and the surface of the crystal within a radius of dozens of feet collapsed. Farah screamed in pain. Like a shockwave, the sea of crystal clusters within 1,000 meters of him shrank in unison. However, this was only a silhouette of the vast battlefield. Thick smoke and dust shrouded the entire battlefield. People had already lost contact with most of the troops, and the people on the battlefield could only fight on their own. Fortunately, the crystal cluster had also lost one of the 3 crystal towers. The White Lion Knight who had launched the attack had long been separated from each other. However, Freya still continued forward, moving in the direction of the other crystal tower in her memory. She was already injured all over, and she pushed away the corpse of a crystal cluster with difficulty. Amidst the cracking sounds, the sword in her hand also broke into several pieces. Freya raised her head with some difficulty. She could still see the scene of the battlefield in the sky. The crystal cluster, giant dragons, floating battleships, griffin knight, and wyvern cavalry weaved in and out of the vast sky. However, the battlefield had already reached its most intense stage, and no one could tell who was who. With an earth-shattering explosion, it was as if a sun had risen in the sky, and the bright light even lit up the layers of clouds. A huge black rhombus-shaped crystal was slowly falling through the clouds, slanting and crashing into the ground. Dazzling flashes kept bursting out from the surface of its rhombus crystal. Those were silver light spots that were crashing into the enormous body that looked like a floating city. And every light spot of light was a floating battleship. The Banksians, Awin, and Bugas resolutely carried out their tactics. Floating ships were gradually leaving the formation. Before they left, they fired their cannons to salute everyone. Then, in the blurry tears of the people, they streaked across the sky and let out a final flash. The Black King Fitztom, who had been insufferably arrogant for 7 generations, had reached its end on this battlefield dominated by mortals. Above its gigantic body, there was an astonishingly large hole. The Silver Elf Lord, whose armor was in tatters, slowly stood up. He was the hero of this generation of the Silver Elves and had experienced countless battles. But here perhaps this would be his final stop. He supported himself with one hand on the edge of Fitzthom's broken surface. Facing the howling wind on the plateau, he took off his helmet and threw it far away. The helmet rolled and disappeared under the clouds. Silver blood flowed from his forehead. Norn wiped it with his hand, and there was also silver blood on his hand. His partner, his comrade for thousands of years, the corpse of the dragon beast lay quietly in the hole. That was the last glory of the Dragon King's cavalry. He pulled out his longsword and threw it down. The longsword drew an arc in the clouds, and gradually became a shining spot of light. The Dragon King's cavalry would never leave their weapons to the enemy, even after they died. Norn suddenly recalled the holy war thousands of years ago. He stood in the valley and watched his father and brother leave. The elves sang hymns and walked out of the valley where they were born and raised. Many of them never came back. That was the era when the light returned. That was also a great war since ancient times. Just like now, the light above the clouds disappeared. Freya slightly narrowed her eyes, which were fascinated by the dried blood. The sky returned to the color of blood. In the center of the sky there was a beautiful silver ring. But it was not a decoration. It was the battlefield between the King of Wizards, Solomon, and Harionov. The 2 strongest wizards in the world were going to compete in such a place at such a time. She looked at the beautiful silver ring and the countless crystal clusters that crashed into it, shattering into pieces and falling to the ground. Then she lowered her head, bent down to pick up another longsword, and slowly walked forward. Smoke and dust covered the whole battlefield. But behind the smoke, the black sphere in the center of the battlefield became more and more obvious. A faint pressure surrounded the whole battlefield. A god was getting closer and closer to this world. Dragons flew over the battlefield from low altitude. They were beginning to gather from all directions. Mithril led the dragons to approach the transmission channel from another direction. The dragons had decided to stop it at all costs. The power of a god, even if it was no longer favored by the law of Tiamat, was not something that mortals could compete with. It was a level of power that was far above that of the King of Black Fitztom. But a shadow was cast in front of Mithril. Arak the Invisible. A huge crystal wasp flapped its wings and flew in the sky, blocking the dragons. Vladimir the Great, who was once again defeated by Solomon, suddenly stopped. Although he looked a little embarrassed, with a scratch on his cheek, and even a piece of his red robe was burned, he looked at the dragons in the distance gloatingly and suddenly laughed. The King of Wizards is indeed the King of Wizards. Solomon, your era even overshadowed the light of all of us. People even think that you are the most powerful wizard in the history of the Bugas. Although I am a little jealous, I have to admit the truth. Vladimir the Great Harionov said in a cadence. You are indeed very strong, stronger than any of us. But unfortunately, you still can't change anything. He raised his hands and said loudly, Look around. No matter how strong you are, can you be stronger than the people of God? Solomon looked at this man quietly. A long time ago he, Sarander, Yuki, and this man, the 4 of them had supported the Silver Alliance of that era. They had experienced the break with the Myrnas, joined forces to fight against the most powerful spellcaster in mortal history, Tumen, and worked together to establish the order of the continent for 1,000 years after the War of the Holy Saints. Since then, the Silver People had watched over the continent left by Martha in the sky. But to his sorrow, his old friends were drifting away from him. Yuki had broken with the others a long time ago and died in the Great Glacier. Although Sarander did not support the ideas of the Sasaldians, he was closer to the Red and Blue Alliance emotionally. And this man left. He was even further away from them. Vladimir the Great, Solomon said quietly. For the sake of the past, I don't want to kill you with my own hands. Bow to the Erewhon and the Wind Elves. At least people will remember the pride of the Sasaldians. This joke isn't funny, Solomon. You're going to ask me to apologize to some mortals? Vladimir the Great sneered. Do you know why others don't agree with your ideas? Because we are Bugas born to be high and mighty. No one is high and mighty, Vladimir the Great. Your power and mine come from Tiamat. Lady Martha's grace belongs to everyone in this world, not you and me. But that's what we deserve. Vladimir roared angrily. I worked tirelessly to learn the truth and knowledge of this world in order to obtain the power and status I have today. All of this is the result of our hard work. How can those mortals be on equal footing with us? Based on what you see now, Solomon replied. In this war the mortals shed no less blood than us, but they get much less than us. We owe them Vladimir the Great. You're crazy, Solomon. You're the crazy one. Solomon enunciated each word clearly. He slowly closed his eyes. I'll say it for the last time, Vladimir the Great, face your own mistakes. You know who should be responsible for this. The glory of the Sasaldians comes from reason and knowledge, not arrogance and conceit. Vladimir the Great sneered. What if I say no? Solomon opened his eyes at once. The majestic and indifferent silver eyes in his eyes were no longer there. What was left was a pair of eyes shining with golden light. It was as if they no longer belonged to a Bugas, but a pair of dragon's pupils. Vladimir the Great swallowed his last sentence in horror. Bloodline sanctification. The Sasaldian wizard leader screamed in horror. This is the power of existence. How can you touch this level? Solomon looked at him coldly. His mottled long hair turned snow-white in an instant. He only stretched out his hand and pointed. Vladimir the Great's expression froze at the last moment. He watched in horror as the eye of truth in his hand cracked and shattered, and then the silver lines of law around his body disappeared one by one. In the end, even his own sense of existence gradually faded. His body was like sand disappearing with the wind. At the last moment of his death, Vladimir the Great suddenly thought of a word. The supreme law. Destruction. Solomon took one last look at the place where Vladimir the Great disappeared, sighed softly, closed his eyes, and did not open them again for a long time. Valhalla City was already in chaos. When the entire stronghold began to shake intensely again, Valhalla City was already in chaos. In the tree hall, Haruz staggered, and the crown on his head fell to the ground, rolling into the distance until a hand held it down and picked it up again. Haruz looked at the man in a daze. Count Audin walked over, handed the crown to him and said softly, Your Majesty. Count Audin, you? Audin looked around and said with some emotion, After the royal faction and Her Royal Highness became enemies, I haven't been here for a long time, but not much has changed after the battle with Ampere Seal. I still remember meeting Her Royal Highness and Count Tonajul here, and nothing has changed. The only thing that has changed is the royal faction itself. He looked at Haruz kindly. Of course you have also changed, Your Majesty. The late king must have been pleased with your growth in the underworld. Haruz held the crown in his hand and stood silently in place. He also thought of his father. That long time ago, his childhood with his sister seemed to have faded a little. Austin raised his head and looked at the tree hall. Through the long glass-arched window, he looked into the distance. There was Valhalla's lush green canopy and the cloudy horizon. Occasionally there would be a flash of lightning across the sky. Outside the walls of Valhalla Fortress, the huge figure of the High Lord Farah was fighting with the Valkyries, intertwining with silver-white lightning. After a moment he said softly, Your Majesty, the royal faction has done many wrong things, but I still remember the era of the late king, and I still feel proud of that moment. We have lost a lot. Our former comrades have left us one by one. Some have died suddenly, some have gone on a different path. Now that I look back, the faces in my memory have disappeared one by one. All that is left is an old man like me who is struggling at death's door. Count Audin, Haruz said softly, That's none of your business. I understand your feelings for Erewhon. Count Audine smiled, and there was a faint light in his eyes. Your Majesty, please allow this old man to make a small contribution to the royal family of Covardo, so that at least 100 years later, when people remember the name of the royal faction, they will not just feel ashamed. He put a letter in front of Haruz. News from the battlefield. The Bugas and the Dragons hope that we Erewhon can spare some time to stop the descent of Cleiss, but we have just lost contact with the White Lion Knight, and even Miss Freya is missing. Haruz looked at the old count in a daze. Count Audine. Count Audine just stared at His Majesty with a determined look. Haruz silently lowered his head, and finally nodded. Count Audine bowed, but in his heart, he recalled the first time he was made a knight. The oath he made under the sword was not broken in the end. In the captain's room of the flagship Akhenaten, Manrique quietly looked at the order handed to him by his first mate. He suddenly remembered Count Audine's somewhat ordinary face. Count Audine was not an important figure in the royal faction, compared to Makarov, compared to Fleetwood, compared to Everton, and even compared to Oberway, who had broken off with the royal faction. But when everyone left the sinking ship, when everyone was deserted, there were always some who still held on to their original beliefs. Because they missed the flash of the past. Manrique suddenly remembered his original intention of coming to Tanajul, and remembered the figure he would never forget. He nodded slightly and said, "Give them the fastest ship and order the fleet to prepare for cover. Make sure everything is done well." The first mate nodded solemnly. Oh. Chapter 1542. On the platform of the tree, fast sailing ships were docking. The Hazel craftsmen were busy with the final modification of these airships. Several White Lion Knight were selecting volunteers, but there were so many volunteers that the emergency passage from the lower level to the upper level was blocked. The young and brave Tanajul sailors were loudly refuting the officer's ridiculous conclusion. In the end, why didn't they choose them? You're too young. Sir, I just look young. Sir, we only recruit soldiers here. No, I'm also a soldier. I used to be a cavalryman of the Southern Army. Look at the wound on my arm. It's from the First War of the Black Rose. Why do you Tanajul people look down on me? The young Hazel craftsman looked at the shouting Erewhon people, shook his head, and returned to his post. The chief mate and the bosun stood beside the handsome young man with a sad face. The young man looked at them and said, "I've told you more than once how this anchoring device works. Its core component is this dimensional anchor. This is a dimensional anchor created by a Circle 13 spell. It can disrupt the teleportation effect. Do you know what a Circle 13 spell is?" Yes. The two men nodded. The young craftsman looked at them suspiciously. In that case, you shouldn't delete the operation steps without permission. Whether it's magic or magical engineering, it's a serious matter. If we lose a ship because of your mistake, do you know how serious the problem is? Yes. The two men replied, sweating profusely. Do you really understand? The young craftsman raised his delicate eyebrows. Yes. The chief mate nodded again and again. But why can't we open the mechanical lock and activate the anchoring device at the same time? This can save us a lot of time. I mean, we're going to die anyway. Can't we just activate the spell? The young craftsman stared at the suspicious guy. The chief mate could only surrender. Your Excellency has the final say. Your Excellency has the final say. In short, the young man nodded with satisfaction. Do you all understand? Understood. The bosun elbowed his comrade and replied, In short, Your Excellency can rest assured and leave this thing to us. The young blacksmith furrowed his brows. His slightly curved eyebrows seemed to reveal a ha. You seem to have misunderstood something. Letting you learn how to operate this thing is just a precaution. Who said I was leaving? Can you operate this anchoring device well? But compared to the professionals, you are still far from. The first mate and the bosun looked at each other. But sir, this ship is. What? Only you are allowed to be brave, but the Hazel people are cowards? He knocked on the Arcanitech device and made a hollow sound. If we can't get rid of that portal, the outcome will be the same even if I stay there. Rather than die at home, I'd rather die at the front lines. But, the first mate replied hesitantly, Your Excellency, you'll be more useful if you stay here. The young blacksmith didn't even lift his eyelids and replied, Then I can't do anything about it. This is the prophet's decision. You can raise objections to your commander. Are there any other questions? The first mate and the bosun looked at each other and could only shake their heads. No problem, no problem. The young man looked at the two and the corners of his mouth curled up as if he had won a victory. The bosun picked up the iron ball on the side and asked, "Then what is this thing? A cannonball?" "This is a small anchoring device," the young blacksmith replied. "It's equipped for the air cavalry. Its function and magic circle are not inferior to this large device, but the range of its influence is much smaller. In short, this thing needs to be close to a certain extent to be useful. Without protection, it's basically impossible for the air cavalry to enter the portal. So, holding it can only be regarded as a psychological comfort." The bosun held the thing in his hand and looked left and right. Finally, he asked, "Can we take it?" "As you wish," the young blacksmith replied. "Although this thing is very precious, there are many of them here." The two of them nodded and took one each. Austin looked at the situation in the port from afar, and suddenly felt a little relieved, because this was such an era. People could generously die in order to protect everything. And this was such an heroine. At this moment it was destined to shine in the long river of the past and the future. With a soft cracking sound, Freya came back to her senses. The sword in her hand had already penetrated the crystal corpse at some point in time. She coughed heavily and blood flowed down from the corner of her mouth. Strands of blood-soaked hair stuck to her forehead. She pulled back the long sword and actually knelt on the ground because of her unstable strength. Her vision turned black, and a series of footsteps sounded. A small group of soldiers passed by her, but due to the smoke and dust, they could not find the Valkyrie of Erewhon. Freya suddenly felt something in her heart. A monotonous buzzing sound echoed above the sky. It was the sound of the magic engine of the fast-sailing ship. She subconsciously raised her head. In the blood-red sky, a few shining silver lines were piercing through the smoke and fog, cutting across the horizon in a straight line. Freya suddenly froze and opened her cracked lips slightly. A flame was shining in the sky. On the three intersecting horizontal lines, the main fleet of the Bugas and the Banksians had already set up a formation. The flames flickered again and again, and a path of flames began to slowly extend forward in the sky. In the center was a small but brave fleet, 23 fast-sailing ships with tall silver sails. They moved forward against the wind, like 23 straight silver lines, straight into the clouds. That was the fleet of Erewhon. Under the bombardment of artillery that exploded like fireworks, the brilliant light reflected on the young faces. At this moment, what unfolded in front of them was not just a picture of a huge battlefield, but a colorful path. The path of fire and light extended forward in the sky. Silver Dragon Mithril also raised her slender neck. In her mercury-like eyes, there were flashes of light reflected. In this chaotic battlefield, it was so dazzling. The silver sails broke through the layers of heavy encirclement, separated the smoke and fog. Erewhon came without hesitation. Accompanied by the dazzling light, pieces of light exploded, and the surging crystal clusters could not stop their advance. She suddenly let out a low groan. The dragon spread out in an instant and surrounded Arak the Formless in the center. At this moment, the offensive and defensive positions seemed to have switched. Looking down from the sky, the 23 tiny spots of light were already approaching the huge black sphere. Solomon silently watched this scene from high up in the sky. He had no energy left to cast any more spells, but at this moment he felt the power of destiny. The mortals stood side by side, and the future of the entire world was connected to each other like never before. Everyone subconsciously looked up and stared at the silver flashes in the sky. Under the attack of the crystal clusters, the 6 outermost fast-sailing ships finally began to slowly fall. Then the other 7 ships. People clenched their fists, but suddenly 3 fast-sailing ships took the initiative to leave the main formation. They accelerated into the sea of crystal clusters. The cannons on both sides spewed out flashes of light, and in the blink of an eye, they were drowned by the sky full of crystal clusters. But just as the light in people's eyes disappeared, the whole sea of crystal clusters suddenly swelled, and a bright flash of light pierced out from it. A newborn sun hung above the clouds, its light scattered in all directions. Facing the light that did not dissipate for a long time, Count Audine walked up to the command platform. Amidst the violent winds, the remaining 7 speedboats had shakily approached their target. "Open the lock." Count Audine calmly gave the order. "Open the lock." Reports came from the remaining airships. "Report the distance." 720. There was the sound of steel twisting in the air. Under the siege of the crystal clusters, the Bonneville on the periphery unfortunately crashed into the Sandeca on the side. The 2 sailing ships broke in midair and fell to the ground with a long tail. "Take care, I wish you victory. Long live Erewhon." This was the last signal from the 2 ships. The target was in sight. Count Audine closed his eyes. 5 ships activated the anchoring device at the same time. 5 tiny light spots finally approached the edge of the black sphere. In the sky, in the floating fleet of the Erewhon, the Banksians and the Bugas, everyone held their breath. Their eyes seemed to have reflected the dazzling light that bloomed when the 13th circle spatial spell was activated. On the other side of the battlefield, a tremor passed through Mithril's heart. The silver dragon lady turned around. On the battlefield, Freya looked up at the sky like a stone statue. Suddenly, a long tail swept out from the black sphere. It first hit Count Audine's ship, then the remaining 4 airships in succession. One by one they were shattered. The specks of light were extinguished, and the fragments that filled the sky fluttered down. In the dark temple, it was so quiet that a pin drop could be heard. Brando silently clenched the hilt of Odorfeist's sword. Cleis, the Lady of the Dead Moon. 10,000 years ago, she was the goddess of sleep and night, the protector of all undead creatures. She was the god of death, but she was also in charge of the priesthood of life because of the cycle of life and death. But not now. After the fall of Tiamat, the lady, along with most of the gods, became the puppet of the Twilight Dragon. At this moment, the 2 sides were standing on opposite sides of a clear line. They were enemies, not friends. Brando turned around and glanced at Andrique. The vampire lady looked away guiltily, but she still looked at her goddess on the throne with a complicated expression. She was once the protector of all undead. At that moment, Mephistopheles and she suddenly understood how the dragons felt. However, the goddess on the throne was very calm. Her eyes were as deep as the stars as she looked at everyone. She seemed to have exhausted all her strength before she slowly opened her mouth to say 3 words. "Kill me." With a clang, the machete in Andrique's hand fell to the ground. Cleis closed her eyes, but when she opened them again, there was only cold murderous intent left in her dark eyes. The huge black sphere was suspended motionlessly on the Karsuk plateau. It was as if nothing had happened. Everyone looked at the scene in a daze. The wreckage of the airship slowly drifted to the ground. The sky was unusually calm, and even the fire had stopped. The 3 airships did not know whether to continue the attack or if the god had come to this world. Manrique touched his cheek and his palm was wet. Outside the porthole there was a black trail in the sky. Was it a sign of the arrival of the end of the world? There was a whining sound on the plateau. It was the sound of the retreat of the troops. No one could compete with a god. The tragedy of the Battle of Metz could not be repeated here. On the battlefield, the Banksians were the first to retreat, followed by the other countries on the Great Plains, followed by the Lion Men of Toquinen, and finally the Highland Knight. Bun-Eyed, the leader of the Highland Knight, wiped the sweat off his palms and looked at the 2 remaining crystal towers on the battlefield from afar. He sighed with regret, but he did not hesitate. He threw down the long sword in his hand and rode back. Behind him there was a silver wave. The Silver Elves and the Earth Legion were covering the retreat of the mortals. But in the tide of retreat, there was one person who was going against the flow. Freya slowly straightened her body and walked forward resolutely. A crystal worm in front of her parted the dust and pounced at her. She swung her sword backward, and the blade and the crystal worm's head split apart. But at the same time, she was knocked away and fell heavily on the ground. Freya gritted her teeth and crawled up again. She wiped the blood off her forehead and walked forward, 1 step at a time. Beside her, some soldiers finally noticed the existence of the Valkyrie of Erewhon. They stopped and looked at the female knight who was going against the flow in surprise. The people stepped aside and let Freya pass through them. Outside Valhalla, Tullman, who was resting, suddenly stood up from the city wall in confusion. In the sky, Solomon opened his eyes again. and a trace of confusion flashed in his eyes. A breath had completely disappeared from the battlefield. The silver dragon lady turned over and dodged Arak's crystal spike. She let out a low-frequency cry, calling for her companions to reform the formation and begin to climb in order to occupy a more advantageous position to attack. 2 or 3 silver lights flashed on the ring on her claw. Mithril lowered her head. It was a message from 2 young dragons from the periphery of the battlefield. Disappeared. She was slightly stunned. Mithril stretched her wings and turned in the air to look at the center of the battlefield. But immediately, a trace of disbelief flashed in her silver eyes. In the sky, there was still a faint pressure from Kleiss, but the teleportation beacon had disappeared. In Valhalla, William opened the door and walked out. He looked up, and his eyes were filled with confusion. The teleportation beacon had disappeared. Why? Could it be that Erwin's people had achieved their goal at the last moment? But they had not arrived. Wait, they had arrived. A flash of light flashed in the mind of the wizard leader. Chapter 1543. She staggered forward step by step, and the smoke finally parted in front of her. Freya coughed and looked up. She squinted her eyes and finally saw the wreckage of the airship in the distance. It was the Vitomir Count Audine's ship. There were many corpses scattered around the wreckage. Freya picked up a broken spear and used it to support her body as a form of self-defense. Then she slowly walked in the direction of the wreckage. But she had only taken a few steps when she kicked something under her feet. Freya looked down and found that it was a white lion medal. She stopped silently and bent down to pick up the medal. Looking up, a little further away, Count Audine's broken sword was lying in the sand, and the Count's ribbon was still hanging on the hilt. Freya looked at the sword quietly, then walked past it and continued to move forward. The air was filled with a burnt smell. The closer she got to the wreckage of the airship, the more debris there were on the ground. Some were equipment on the airship, some were personal belongings. Freya also saw some disgusting mutilated bodies, or the charred frame of the airship that was still burning. Then she saw the most complete corpse along the way. It was a bosun with a look of disbelief on his face. In his blood-stained palm, he seemed to be holding something tightly. Freya lowered her head, squatted down, and gently pried open the man's cold and stiff fingers, ready to dig out the thing. But it was at this time that a weak voice stopped her. "Don't move!" Freya was shocked. She turned around and saw a hazel man covered in blood lying under a few twisted iron plates not far away. A curved steel bar pierced through the man's lung. He coughed, and the light in his eyes was so weak that it was almost invisible. Freya hurried to the man's side and subconsciously reached for her medicine box, but it was empty. Only then did she remember that she had used it all in the previous battle. She looked at the man apologetically and found that he was still a young man with a delicate and quiet face. "I'm sorry, however." The young blacksmith shook his head at her and said weakly, "Close the lock first. Remember not to trigger the anchoring device." "What did you say?" Freya was slightly stunned. The man glanced at her and repeated in an almost inaudible voice, "Turn off the lock first. Don't trigger the anchoring device." Freya finally understood what he was talking about. "Is that a space anchoring device?" The young craftsman's gloomy eyes shone brightly as if he had just regained consciousness. "You know him." Freya hurriedly took out her knight badge. "I'm Freya, a senior officer on Erwin's side." "Very good." The young blacksmith's eyes flashed and he used all of his strength to ask, "Can you fly?" "What did you say?" "Let me ask you, can you fly?" He could only raise a finger with great effort. His slender finger weakly pointed to the sky. "Send it up there." "Me?" The young blacksmith nodded slightly. The light in his eyes was almost gone. Freya held his hand and asked in a low voice, "Tell me, what's your name?" "Kia Fayak, Corporal." "You're a girl." Freya looked at the man in surprise. Only an almost inaudible voice told her softly, "My home is in Hazel. Tell my mother." "It hurts." The voice was fading. Freya put down the man's hand silently. She looked up and suddenly felt a little sour in her nose. "Maybe," she replied softly. "I think I can fly." The girl had already fallen asleep under her feet. 3 messages were sent to Mithril's ring at the same time. "Do you remember the battle in the wilderness of 4 territories?" Someone is attacking Claire's body. Stop her from teleporting a second time and escaping from the underworld of Helm. Solomon, William, and Tolman. A bright light flashed in the silver dragon lady's silver eyes. She suddenly spread her wings and dove down to avoid Arak's pursuit. At the same time, she sent the same message to the communication crystal. What should I do? A moment later, a message flashed on the ring. Lady Mithril, come to my side. Freya? Mithril was slightly startled. A bright light suddenly appeared in her vision. The light disappeared in a flash. It was at the center of the Karsuk Highlands battlefield. The ring flashed again. I have a way to stop the teleportation. Mithril no longer hesitated. She immediately rolled and flew down. The tips of her wings drew two beautiful arcs in the sky. This elegant tactical movement immediately made the dragons understand her meaning. Kin of Gold, spread out the attack formation and cover me. The group of dragons let out a clear and long cry in unison, then scattered in all directions. On the battlefield in the distance, Freya held the silver ring high in her hand. She looked at the silver arc in the sky with gratification in her eyes. In just a moment, the dragon spread its wings and flew over her head. The female knight pressed down her long hair, turned around and chased after Mithril. The silver dragon lady flapped her wings and slowly landed on the ground. She then looked up at Mithril. Freya, why are you still here? Mithril asked doubtfully. Didn't you retreat with the others? You said you have a way to stop Claire's teleportation. Is that true? Freya nodded. This is the wreckage of Count Audine's airship. I found a space-time anchor device on it. Space-time anchor device? Mithril asked in surprise. Is it still intact? Freya opened her palm to reveal the intricate brass sphere in her hand. She looked at the silver dragon lady and said, I can guarantee that it's still intact. Even the lock is intact. Mithril's heart skipped a beat. Do you know how to use it? Freya nodded lightly. Amandina taught me how to use the Magitech device. Very well. The silver dragon lady's narrow eyes shone brightly. She nodded without hesitation. Get on my back. I'll send you to the center of the portal. She then put down one of her tails and wrapped the female knight on her back. Mithril turned her slender neck and looked at Freya. There's no saddle, so you'll have to make do with it. You can hold on to my scales. Don't be afraid, I won't feel any pain. Thank you, Mistress Mithril. Freya was not used to the dragon's jokes. She was a little restrained. Mithril nodded and said seriously, this should be a small space-time anchor device. We have to pass through the outer area of the portal. It's filled with spatial turbulence. I can protect you for a moment with my magic, but my mana is limited. We only have one chance. Do you understand? Freya nodded slowly. It's good that you understand. Mithril looked at her with satisfaction. She then flapped her wings and slowly left the ground. After circling a few times in the air, she began to climb higher. Above their heads was a huge black sphere. It was like a low-hanging dark cloud that shrouded the entire battlefield. Countless crystal clusters circled below the black sphere like a flock of ravens, protecting the portal. Freya looked at the ground one last time, then clenched the bronze sphere in her hand. The human and dragon soared straight into the clouds, and the silver dragon lady let loose a series of low-frequency roars from deep within her throat. These low dragon roars could be transmitted to an area over 100 kilometers away, but only the giant dragons could hear them. She was giving orders to the dragons. Kin of Gold, stay close to me. Stop Arak from approaching. The dragons roared as they descended. On the other side of the battlefield, the High Lord of the Crystal Clusters, Arak, had just noticed the strange movement in this direction through his complex crystal eyes. But from the corner of his eyes, he saw dozens of shining light spots suddenly descending from the clouds. Gold dragons. On Mithril's back, Freya also picked up her communication crystal. She paused for a moment, then softly said, This is Freya, Grand Commander of the White Lion Knight Order. This is Freya, I'm Grand Commander of the White Lion Knight Order. On the Tanajal's flagship, the Akhenaten, everyone in the captain's room was strangely quiet. Manrique slowly put down the commander's sword in his hand. He turned his head and quietly looked at the communication crystal ball that was making a sound. I repeat, this is Freya, I'm Grand Commander of the White Lion Knight Order. In the main battleships of the Buga and Banksians, On every communication crystal ball in every communication room, the same voice was conveying the same message to everyone. In estimated 3 minutes, Silver Dragon Lady Mithril and I will arrive at the target location and send the anchoring device into the portal. I request cover. I repeat, I request cover. On the Banksian's glory of the Empire, Count Gonzalez slowly turned around. On the Akhenaten, Manrique had already put on his captain's cape and hat. He picked up his communication crystal, took a deep breath and gave the order word by word. All fleets listen up. Turn to the 6 o'clock direction and prepare to deploy the battle line with the Eagle as the reference. In the sky above, the 3 floating fleets that were slowly retreating from the battlefield stopped one by one. Countless floating battleships began to turn around in mid-air, but when they formed 3 lines on the battlefield again, the roar of cannon fire once again resounded through the sky of Karsuk. Iron and fire fell from the sky, and the light of the explosion lit up the entire plateau. This sudden explosion attracted the attention of every soldier on the plateau. Everyone stopped in their tracks and turned around in confusion. Didn't they already start to retreat? Where did the cannon fire come from? Who were the fleets attacking? Fiery sparks exploded in the sky. Under everyone's gazes, the Silver Dragon Lady spread open her wings and weaved through the cannon fire. She was as graceful as a fluttering butterfly. And everyone finally noticed the slender figure on the back of the butterfly. Suddenly there was a burst of cheers on the battlefield. The thunderous cheers came from the direction of Oween's people, but soon, it swept across the entire plateau. Valkyrie! Miss Valkyrie! Why is she there? What happened? Everyone looked at the scene in midair in shock, and in their vision, the tiny light spot finally approached the edge of the black ball of light. At that moment everyone clenched their fists, and the White Lion Knight could not help but close their eyes. Everyone was afraid that history would repeat itself. After all, that was their commander, the heroic lady from Erewhon. But a miracle happened. Amidst the continuous flames and crystal cluster Lord Arak's angry roar, the tiny silver light spot suddenly accelerated at the last moment and plunged into the black ball. The battlefield was completely silent. But everyone subconsciously raised the sword in their hand. The tip of the sword pointed to the sky, as if a bright forest had risen. For wound! It was a silent cry. In the endless darkness, Freya finally saw the scene in front of her. The boundary between heaven and earth had disappeared, and in the pitch-black void, there were gravel wreckage of floating battleships, shattered crystal clusters, and even human corpses. Violent spatial storms blew from all directions, sweeping everything from the Karsuk Plateau into the depths of the black hole. The space was so vast, and in the center of the black hole, a tall woman like a giant was looking at them coldly. Cly stood in the center of the void, her wild long hair fluttering in the wind. Half of her body was still under the black hole, and the other half was struggling to support the world. Her weapon, the pitch-black bladed whip called Fafnir's Fang, was tightly held in her hand. The Valkyrie subconsciously held her breath. That was a true god. Mithril seemed to feel Freya's nervousness and comforted her. Be careful, we only have one chance. Freya came back to her senses and nodded firmly. She bit her lip so hard that it almost bled. Clyce glared at the 2 insects that broke into her territory, but she seemed to be hesitant and did not make a move. The Silver Dragon Lady understood at a glance that Clyce was probably dealing with the intruders that attacked her body, and had no time to care about other things. This was the best chance for them. Freya, she whispered. The good news is that Clyce is distracted. I'm going to cut into the inner ring of the spatial storm, be ready. Freya nodded slowly. The Silver Dragon Lady suddenly let out a long howl, spread her wings and changed direction to cut towards Clyce. At this moment the vicious goddess finally could not take it anymore. She suddenly straightened her body, raised the whip in her hand, and swung it in their direction. However, Mithril was already prepared for this. She turned her body slightly, and the huge whip passed by her body. A terrifying soul energy swept past the 2 of them. Freya felt that she was going to die immediately, as if her soul was going to fly out of her body. The Silver Dragon Lady saw this and shouted, "Don't mind that thing, it's soul essence." But just as she was distracted, she felt a sharp pain in her left eye, and suddenly she lost her vision on one side forever. The Silver Dragon Lady let out a shrill scream. but she still insisted on turning around and protecting Freya behind her. "Lady Mithril, are you okay?" Freya shouted in the wind. "I'm fine." Mithril endured the pain and replied. "Freya, get ready." The whip finally passed by the two of them. And now, Mithril flipped her body in the air. Freya only saw a bright light in front of her, and Clyce's huge face appeared in her vision. But at this moment, the female knight's heart was extremely calm. She immediately unlocked the spatial anchor device and activated the spell on it. "For Erwin! For Wond!" Freya shouted, and used all her strength to throw the brass ball out. "Kia, please protect us." The brass ball slowly slid to the center of the void, and time slowed down as if it had stopped. But the next moment, Freya only heard a shrill sound as if the sky was falling, and a dazzling white light hit her. Her eyes widened and then her eyes rolled back, and she lost all consciousness. Clyce screamed and fell back on her throne. When her eyes regained their clarity, she lowered her head and quietly looked at the holy sword Odorfice that was stabbed into her chest. She looked at the golden blood slowly seeping out from under her robe, and a trace of peace appeared on her face. "Well done, children." She looked at Andrique and Mephistopheles with gentle eyes and said softly. Andrique looked at this scene in a daze. Her mouth was open but she couldn't say a word. Mephistopheles came up from behind and silently covered his sister's eyes with his hand. He turned his head away and didn't say a word. Brando quietly looked at the dying god. "Goddess." But Clyce gently shook her head. "There are no more gods in this world, and we are just ghosts that wander here, living like walking corpses. Perhaps death is the true release." She smiled and even had the mood to joke with Brando. "Only the holy sword can hurt me. You came here with it, perhaps it is the choice of fate." Brando kept silent. She was the blessed of death for countless years, shrouding this world with sleep and night. Although she was the god of the dead, she symbolized the hope of life. She stood in front of the gate of Aladdin's divine kingdom with a scythe in her hand, protecting the dead who came here to find eternal sleep. She was the goddess of the dead moon, and her divine kingdom was the peaceful home of all the dead. But she had lost her favor, and perhaps the gods were long gone. Mephistopheles tightly pursed his lips and looked up. Andrique sobbed in a low voice. Clyce's gaze was very calm. She looked at Brando and said softly, "Many years ago, I had foreseen the arrival of this day. I saw your face in countless years, so why have you come?" "Me?" Brando was silent for a moment and then quietly replied, "I have come to end everything." "What is the end of everything?" Brando didn't answer this question but asked in return, "Goddess, what caused the gods to leave this world? Who defeated you?" The goddess smiled lightly, and her eyes showed weakness. "You have already guessed, haven't you?" Brando was silent. He turned his head and saw the same worry in the little female dragon's eyes. The gods created them and abandoned them, but in the end they died because of them and an era came to an end. He who was standing here represented another part of this plan. But did the gods and the people of the gods foresee their ending? Brando looked at the sword in his hand, and for a moment, he was a little confused. The goddess gently closed her eyelids. She said softly, "Child, this is a debt but also a hope. Without bronze there would be no black iron." Clyce's body finally turned into light dust, and slowly floated from her throne, and finally disappeared. Just like that, a god left this world forever in her god kingdom. Andrique finally sobbed and fell on her brother's shoulder, crying bitterly. Only a low sobbing sound could be heard in the darkness. After a moment, Scarlet asked in a low voice, "My lord, who caused the gods to leave this world? Who defeated Clyce and the other gods, and made our era lose the glory of the gods?" "It was the Bronze Clan." How is that possible?" The Highlander girl's eyes widened. "It was the monsters that killed the gods?" "It was the Godslayer," Brando said softly. "I should have known that the owner of this name was the Bronze Clan. The gods created the Bronze generation and abandoned them. The Bronze Clan, who held a grudge, turned to dusk but betrayed again, because all they wanted was revenge." He turned around and asked, "Do you know the legend of the Eternal One?" Except for the little female dragon Alaz, everyone shook their heads. Brando looked at them and replied, "Because it is an existence beyond the gods, a perfect product, an eternal and immortal creature in this world." How can there be such an existence? Irene asked in confusion. Then isn't it dusk? Brendel shook his head. Because it is the ultimate existence of another plan, the ultimate weapon that the divine citizens will use to fight against dusk. It is the pinnacle of the Bronze Tribe, but I didn't manage to guess its identity even though the hint was so obvious. What is it? Medisha asked. The little female dragon Alaz took 2 steps forward and came to Tia's side. And the light ball in the little girl's hand, the straight light was pointing towards the dome of the holy sanctum. Brando's gaze followed the light, 2 world tree roots intertwined with each other above the dome, and disappeared into the darkness and fog. Do you see it? Brando replied. It is there, where the world tree roots converge in the lower realm, the pinnacle of this world, the Emerald Summit. Medisha gasped softly. She suddenly looked up and said in disbelief, Is it the Eternal One, the Eternal Dragon, the Emerald Dragon Nidhogg? Brando nodded slowly. In the depths of the darkness, the merchant girl's eyes had a faint smile, staring at a spot of light in the distance. And there was Ilyodinur's divine kingdom. Behind her, the roar of the wind was becoming more and more deafening, and the sea of the netherworld suddenly surged with raging waves, washing away the foundation of the world, as if the entire world was about to be torn apart by these waves. It was like the death knell of the entire wound, echoing in the depths of the void, and in the darkness of chaos, a behemoth was slowly awakening. As its consciousness awakened, the entire world's crystal wall let out a fragmenting sound. Then a golden eye slowly opened. It had finally awakened. The Roman laughed softly, and the laughter echoed in the darkness and the silent fog. Oh! Chapter 1544. When Freya woke up from her drowsy state, she struggled to blink her eyes. In her blurry vision, the first thing she saw was a blood-red sky. Her vision gradually enlarged. Pillars of smoke were hanging at the edge of the sky. Crystal clusters flew overhead, and occasionally 1 or 2 flames lit up the dark sky in the east. The light of the stars had already appeared in the sky. The stars twinkled in the lavender sky in the east. Occasionally a bright flash would explode in the sky. It was either a battleship firing or a crash landing. Then she saw the Silver Dragon Lady looking at her with concern. The Silver Dragon Lady's left eye was tightly shut, and silver blood kept flowing out of it. Freya was dazed for a moment before she finally remembered what had happened. She asked in a hoarse voice, Lady Mithril, your eye? Mithril shook her head, indicating that she was fine. I'm sorry, Freya said softly. That's not your fault, Mithril replied. You've done well enough. Did we succeed? Mithril nodded solemnly. Freya felt dizzy with happiness. She looked at the golden-red clouds in a daze. The light of the setting sun seemed to burn the entire sky. After a while, she regained her strength and asked softly, Did we win? We won part of it, Mithril replied. Part of it. The Silver Dragon Lady moved aside silently, allowing Freya to see the other side of the sky. Above the golden clouds, the center of the battlefield was calm. The huge portal had disappeared. Freya's gaze was fixed, and her snow-white cheeks gradually climbed up her cheeks. At some point, a golden flame was reflected in her brown eyes. It was a bright golden line. It lay quietly in the sky, spewing out endless flames. It was slowly opening. Freya finally saw what it was. It was an opening eye, a golden red eye with a vertical pupil. It was above the sky, overlooking the earth. The flame-like clouds hung low, and countless meteors were slowly descending from the clouds, falling to the ground. It was a gigantic dragon that spanned across heaven and earth. It was dusk. Freya opened her mouth slightly and said hoarsely, It's awake. Yes, it's awake. The Silver Dragon Lady also looked in that direction. A layer of fire was reflected in her silver eyes as she replied softly, After an era, the nightmare of our world has once again descended upon this land. Is it all over? No, we still have hope. Hope? The Silver Dragon Lady held Freya's hand and replied, Have you forgotten, Freya? Our battle is over, but another battle has just begun. Valkyrie suddenly quieted down. She listened quietly to the sound of her heartbeat, steady and strong. That was his war. This was an ancient and verdant dream. When Brando stopped and looked at the crystal forest in front of him, such a thought appeared in his mind. Crystal clusters stood in great numbers, emitting emerald light. They sparkled with each other, and sacred ancient trees surrounded the area, forming a peaceful holy land. He looked up. Above his head, countless world tree roots rose from the darkness and mist, intertwining with each other and converging here, forming the base of a giant tree. The Jadeite Summit was a term used to describe this place countless years ago. It was the peak of the mortal realm, connected to the country of mist, the country of death, and the scorching river. In the previous life, the players had found the entrance to this place from the scorching river. And this place was the lair of the most powerful being in this world, the verdant dragon. Although its name was verdant, Nidhogg was a genuine black dragon. The reason it got its name was because of its holy blood, which was as green as jade. Brando only realized now that it wasn't because Nidhogg was special, but because it was a bronze dragon. Because that blood was bronze blood. He also understood why Nidhogg hid here for thousands of years and gnawed on the foundation of the world tree endlessly. The ambiguous background story in the Amber Sword finally turned into a clear answer here. Because the verdant dragon's purpose here was the throne of destiny. Eternal time did not dissolve its hatred for the gods. It wanted revenge for everything that Martha had created, and it wanted to completely destroy the world that she had protected with her own hands. Brando just never dreamed that the invincible world boss in the Amber Sword, after everything ended, would return to its original goal in this world. He still came here. He looked at this place, and there seemed to be a strange feeling in his heart, a connection from another world. The souls of countless people were tied together with him, but whether he really had to face the eternal dragon, Brando was not sure. Everyone carefully moved forward in the crystal forest, and everyone was cautious not to speak. After all, the owner of this place was a mythical existence. His subordinate, Garm the Vicious Hound, was a notorious existence in the Divine War, not to mention the master himself. Of course, no one would expect the owner to be hospitable. The forest was quiet. Tia and Hipamra tilted their heads and looked at the reflections on the crystal bark, which could actually reflect their faces. It was just that on the divided mirror the reflections were big and small, and some were distorted exaggeratedly. Tia was shocked, and Miss Priestess had an interesting look on her face. Apart from the two of them who still had the mind to pay attention to these details, the others looked more or less serious. I finally understand. The Shire finally couldn't help but speak, and he whispered to Mephistopheles, "Why the bronze dragon appeared here, so their boss is here." Mephistopheles nodded, indicating that he agreed. And the dear demoness Helene walked at the front of the group. She had been alone in the darkness for thousands of years, and was the most suitable to adapt to the solitude here. Moreover, the crystal forest was kind of like home to her. She looked around and said, "This place doesn't look like it has been broken in by outsiders." "You mean we have already rushed ahead of the dusk?" Alaz asked. "That's hard to say," Helene replied. "The road to the Emerald Summit is not only the kingdom of the dead. I remember the legend said that Nidhogg himself arrived here from the world of ice and snow in the kingdom of mist. But at least we can't see the corpses of the dusk species here, right?" The Shire continued, "And most importantly, it means that we are not on the same path as the Emerald Dragon. You may not believe it, but this is a big relief." Brando looked back at Tia. The elven girl was still holding the light ball in her hand, and the light on the light ball was pointing straight ahead. Although he had never been to this place in person, he had seen a lot of related videos, and quickly figured out where it was. If he remembered correctly, there were a few world tree roots in front of them, and the gap between the roots formed a huge valley. The players called it the Altar Valley because there was a square conical altar in the middle of the valley. When Brando thought of the altar, he had a vague guess in his heart. Sure enough, it did not take long for them to walk out of the crystal forest. The view in front of them suddenly opened up, and a beautiful valley jumped into their vision. Everyone could not help but stop. The valley in the distance was actually a sea of grass, dotted with crystal forests far and near. A waterfall fell from the world tree root, and after flowing through the entire valley, it poured into a sparkling lake on the horizon. Tia saw this scene and was so surprised that her mouth was wide open. She was not the only one. In fact, if they did not see it with their own eyes, no one would believe that there was such a beautiful place in such a lower world. Only Brando had expected this, and so he saw the tall altar in the valley at a glance. It was a pyramid-shaped altar that stood in the sea of grass. The whole thing was made of obsidian, and so it was very conspicuous in the green field. Brando noticed that the black main body of the altar was covered with a dense crystal grid. He had seen many of these things in the deadly frost forest and the loop of trade winds, and he knew at a glance that this thing could not be separated from the network of Tiamat. Brando walked forward, but behind him Scarlet asked worriedly, "Will the Emerald Dragon be here?" Brando shook his head. He was not particularly worried about this. Although the Emerald Summit was Nidhogg's lair, the Emerald Dragon did not always stay in this place. More often than not, it was above the World Tree gnawing at the foundation of the law of Tiamat, and often only returned to its lair to rest for a few times a year. Of course, the explanation in the Amber Sword was that players could only challenge the Dragon of Eternity for a few times a year, if there was really someone who came to challenge it. So Brando explained to the Highlander girl, "Nidhogg has been fighting with the law of Tiamat for a long time, and always fought until it was covered in bruises, and only then would it return to the Emerald Summit to rest. This kind of battle has been going on for thousands of years, almost endless, so it would not be long before it returned to the Emerald Summit." "But I don't understand," Scarlet frowned. "Why would it do that?" "Naturally, it's because of their hatred of the gods." Alaz continued. "The Bronze Tribe hates everything created by the gods, including our world itself. The sad thing is," the little female dragon continued, "even if it represents eternity, it can't bite through the foundation of the law of Tiamat, so for it, this battle is destined to go on forever." "What a sad fate." The Shire shrugged. As they talked, they had reached the edge of the altar. Brando raised his head and looked at the tall altar. The light on the light ball in Tia's hand was almost connected to the altar. "Looks like we're here." The Shire saw the light and said, "What should we do next?" "Who has the Lionheart sword?" Brando asked. "It's with me," Medisha quickly replied. She lowered her head and was about to reach for the Lionheart sword hanging on her waist, but at this time, the whole valley suddenly trembled slightly. At that moment, everyone subconsciously stopped what they were doing. Tia was so scared that she immediately ran behind her sister. Everyone else raised their weapons, but Brando looked around carefully and found that after the sudden tremor, there seemed to be no abnormality in the valley. "The tremor is coming from above." Irene looked up cautiously and pointed at the top of her head. "It's not close to here. It should be the Emerald Dragon." Brando thought for a moment and replied, "It may be attacking the World Tree." Tia was shocked. She stuck out her little tongue and asked in surprise, "It's not close to us, but it can still make such a big commotion? How big is it?" "Of course it's not small," Brendel replied. "It's a perfect existence after all. It holds the only eternal element in the world of Vaunt. The Emerald Dragon is defined as existing in countless parallel worlds and times at the same time. Even if it dies in a certain place at a certain moment, it will be revived because of its existence in another place at another moment." "My lord, does that mean we can't kill it?" "That's why it's called immortal." Brando nodded and replied, "In the other plan of the gods, it was originally used as the ultimate weapon against the Twilight. But things are unpredictable. Perhaps they didn't expect that what they created with their own hands would be such a disaster." "Against me?" Suddenly, a sneer came from the valley. Brando looked up abruptly. That voice. It was the voice that described the deepest nightmares in his heart countless times in the middle of the night. The voice that woke him up time and time again. That was Roman's voice. Everyone turned around and saw the merchant lady slowly walking out from the sea of grass. She looked at the others and smiled. "Nidhogg is only fit to be a watchdog. How can its power be called eternal? Brando, in front of you, the so-called King of Bronze is not even worth mentioning." Brando looked at Roman quietly. He looked at the girl who escaped from Butchie with him and Freya and dreamed of being a merchant. She had a faint smile on her face, as if everything that happened 6 years ago was just a dream. And the promise he made to this girl in the past had become his biggest regret today. He said quietly, "Twilight Dragon, since you are controlling this body, as enemies, I hope we can at least respect you." The smile on Roman's face gradually disappeared. She looked at Brando. "If it wasn't to completely destroy your world, why would I come here? All of this is because of that damned woman. If she hadn't thrown Tiamat into the chaos, I could have easily reduced you to dust." A voice rang out. At the end of the day, it's because you are just a consciousness born from the chaos. Twilight, although you are powerful, you cannot represent this world. A figure walked out from behind the Highlander girl. It was Ovina. She looked coldly at the Twilight and said, "If you hadn't started that battle, why would we have come to this world? But it doesn't matter. The war that has lasted for generations will come to an end. And that moment will be the moment you lose." Azure, Roman glared hatefully at Ovina. "Our debt will be settled sooner or later." Just as she finished speaking, the entire valley suddenly shook violently again. Everyone subconsciously raised their heads because they could clearly feel that the source of the tremors this time was much closer than the previous one. The Twilight Dragon also looked up at the dome of the World Tree and smiled. "It seems that Nidhogg has already sensed your presence." "Me?" Brando frowned. "Do you still not understand?" The Twilight Dragon's smile was eerie. "Nidhogg exists in every space and time. This is the so-called eternity. But there is a law in this world that can lock down every space and time. It is destined to counter this so-called eternity. Do you think it won't sense it?" Brando suddenly understood. Wasn't his element of time and space the greatest nemesis of the Emerald Dragon? But what made his expression change was that the Twilight Dragon said that Nidhogg had already noticed his presence. Didn't that mean that it was hurrying towards the Emerald Peak? It was at this time that the Jadeite summit shook for the third time. The shaking was so violent that Tia bumped into her sister. The others also lost their footing and looked up instinctively. This time, everyone could clearly feel that a giant creature had arrived above them. "What a good show!" The merchant girl smiled and looked at each of them with her hands behind her back. "But I'm afraid I don't have much time to waste here. Brando, don't you want to see your little lover?" Brando was slightly stunned, and a bad premonition suddenly flashed in his heart. The Roman raised her hand and snapped her fingers gently. A person gradually appeared behind her. Who else could it be but Amandina? Everyone saw that Amandina's expression was blank. She was obviously under the control of a spell. "Miss Amandina?" Medisha couldn't help but call out in a low voice. Brendel's eyes were burning with anger. He stretched out his hand, and the holy sword Odorfice appeared in his hand almost instantly. His figure moved, and without thinking, he stabbed towards the Twilight Dragon with flash strike sword art. But the Roman didn't move. The space in front of her bent slightly, and a giant crystal claw dozens of feet tall appeared out of thin air, blocking Brando's attack with a clang. The merchant girl calmly pulled out the sword in her hand and placed the blade on the motionless Amandina's neck. She said leisurely, "Why are you worried about your little lover? Have you forgotten that I'm the real mistress of the Abbeys? I'm your fiancé, dear Brando." Brando gritted his teeth and looked at her, taking a step back. Chapter 1545. The sky outside the window was already dark red. Golden meteors fell from the clouds from time to time and crashed into the ground. On the highlands, flashes of fire could be seen from far and near. It was already late, but the battle was still going on. In the northern sky, the floating fleet and dragons were still fighting against Iraq the Formless. After losing almost all of their top combatants, the battle had turned into a bitter war of attrition. Delphine gently put down the quill in her hand and stared blankly out of the window with her chin propped on her hand. Terrified screams could be heard from time to time. At this moment, even Valhalla Fortress was in chaos. She turned her purple eyes slightly and looked in another direction. Below the fortress, Falafel the Errant was already on the verge of collapse. However, the number of Valkyries that flew up to fight was decreasing. Only the shining silver fire in the darkness was still the center of the battle. The Prime Minister's daughter was silent for a moment. Creak. The door behind her opened. She turned around and saw Mithril knocking on the door and coming in. The silver dragon lady had changed into a clean robe, but her face was still pale. She rejected the goodwill of the people and simply washed her injured eye. Mithril stood in front of Delphian. The Prime Minister's daughter also looked up. The two in the room looked at each other in silence. "I heard that you were here," Mithril said softly. "I thought you would go with him." "Your eye?" Delphian asked. Mithril shook her head, indicating that she was not in the way. Delphian was silent for a moment. She picked up the quill again and scribbled something on the paper. But Mithril looked at Delphian's hand and said softly, "You are afraid, right?" Delphian's quill stopped. "Everyone will be afraid." She deliberately looked at the golden-red sky outside the window and smiled. I am not extraordinary. But what you are afraid of is different from others, isn't it? The silver dragon lady said. Delphian. No. The Prime Minister's daughter shook her head. There is no difference. She lowered her head, flipped open a page of the document and signed it. But Mithril looked at her quietly and said, It's upside down. What? Delphian was stunned and raised her head. Mithril pointed at the document in her hands and said, You're holding it upside down. Delphian's hand paused, and the quill fell on the paper. She stood rooted to the ground, her mind in a mess. The wind was quiet, and the crystal trees in the valley emitted a faint fluorescent light. The light gathered together as if it could light up the darkness of the entire underground world. The jadeite mountain peak was like a lighthouse emitting endless light in the kingdom of the dead, standing tall in the darkness and fog. There was another dull rumble. The gigantic creature was getting closer and closer above their heads. Dust and ice chips were falling from the crisscrossing roots of the world tree in the mist. Brando quietly looked at the blade on Amandina's neck. He looked at Romaine and asked coldly, Twilight Dragon, what do you want? What do I want? I just want Miss Amandina to do me a small favor. If it weren't for her connection with the Lionheart sword, it would have taken me a lot of effort to find this place. The Roman smiled happily. And there's more to come. As soon as she finished speaking, a silver dagger suddenly appeared in Amandina's hand. Before Brando could react, she raised the dagger and stabbed it into her own chest without hesitation. Crimson blood instantly soaked through the layers of clothes and spurted out. Brando could hardly believe his eyes. Twilight Dragon! Brando shouted furiously, and punched the giant crystal claw in front of the Roman. The claw's owner, the crystal tyrant Astoni, appeared behind the Roman and was almost sent flying by the punch. Brando did not care about anything else. He flashed to Amandina's side and caught the falling Amandina with both hands. The Roman had no intention of stopping him. Instead, she stood aside and watched the scene with interest. She walked to Astoni's side, held the crystal tyrant's claw, and jumped up with small steps. The crystal tyrant stood up and walked past Brando. Its huge body made the valley tremble slightly with every step it took. Brando did not even look at them. He only carefully poured the holy water into Amandina's mouth. Amandina choked and coughed. She opened her eyes, and her dark eyes finally regained their clarity. When she saw Brando, tears flowed down her cheeks. My lord! Brando was about to speak, but he suddenly froze. Because he saw the dagger in Amandina's chest rising up by itself. Although the wound on Amandina's chest was healing under the effect of the holy water, the blood in the blood was still floating. However, the blood on the dagger was floating around. Droplets of blood flew out from the dagger and floated in midair. The countless droplets of blood seemed to have lost their gravity and flew into the sky. They merged with each other and formed a fist-sized blood ball. And within this blood ball there was a faint golden light. Brando stared at this scene in a daze. He suddenly felt a throbbing in his heart. It was the resonance of the law of Tiamat. And it was at this moment that the Emerald Summit shook again. Shock waves came from outside the valley, followed by a deafening roar. Amandina was also stunned. She almost thought that she had seen wrongly. She asked with a pale face. My blood is glowing? Not far away, the Roman sat on Astoni's claw and also looked up at the blood ball that was radiating golden light. She held the edge of the claw with both hands and kicked her feet. She sighed and said, The blood of the sage, you hid it so well, Martha. At this moment Tia's scream came from afar. Ah! Help, this ball of light is moving on its own. I can't hold it anymore. Beside the elven girl, Andrea was the first to turn around and quickly grab the ball of light in Tia's hand. But it was at this moment that the light on the ball of light suddenly became incomparably dazzling. The vampire felt as if her hand was being burned by the light, and she immediately screamed and shrank back. It was at this moment that the ball of light suddenly left Tia's hand and flew into the air. Medisha instinctively stabbed her spear in that direction, but the ball of light seemed to have a consciousness of its own and avoided the attack. On the other side, Irene was chanting and summoned countless vines from the ground to block the ball of light in the air. But before they could get close, they were burned to ashes by the light of the ball of light. And just when everyone was caught off guard, Medisha suddenly heard a soft buzzing sound. She looked down and was surprised to find that the lionheart sword hanging at her waist was vibrating slightly. A moment later, the sword of King Eric unsheathed itself and floated in the air. A drop of golden blood separated from the sword and flew into the distant sky. The ball of blood, the ball of light, and the drop of golden blood met above the valley and violently collided with each other before fusing into one. At that moment, the entire valley seemed to resonate with the grass and crystallized trees trembling at the same time. A golden light hung down from the world tree above and shot into the ball of light. And as the ball of light shone brightly, it suddenly came to the altar in the middle of the valley and slowly opened a door of light. Looking at the door of light, the Roman's eyes finally revealed a scorching light. She almost immediately stood up from Estoni's claw. "Stop her!" Seeing this scene, Brando immediately shouted, "That's not her real body. Prioritize attacking the Crystal King Estoni." But in fact there was no need for him to give the order. The spear in Medisha's hand had already flown out, but the Crystal King raised its hand and blocked the spear. On the other side, Ropar and Irene had already blocked in front of Estoni. The Shire even used magic to create a barrier. But with just one punch from Estoni, Ropar and Irene could only retreat and the barrier was shattered. Brando saw this and picked up the blade of golden flames, gently putting it down. Amandina was about to join the battle, but Amandina grabbed his hand. She seemed to have finally regained her senses and said anxiously, "My lord, go save Miss Yuta." "Yuta?" Brando was stunned. What happened to her? "She's still outside." "She's outside?" Estoni stepped forward step by step, but the Roman sitting on its palm sneered at the people in front of her and said sarcastically, "Look at whose sword this is." As she spoke, she hooked the long sword in her hand and threw it down high. The long sword spun and fell, stabbing into the soft ground. Only then did everyone see that the long sword was Yuta's sword, the fire raven's tongue. At this moment the ground suddenly shook violently, and the entire Emerald Peak seemed to be about to collapse. Everyone's expression changed drastically. The weaker ones, such as the Nightsong Tiger and Falerne, lost their footing and fell directly to the ground. Brando subconsciously turned around. Outside the valley, a huge head slowly walked in from there. What kind of creature was that? It was just a head, but it occupied a corner of the valley. Even the towering crystal tyrant Estoni paled in comparison to this dragon. Yes, it was a dragon. To be exact, it was a black dragon. However, under the black scales that covered its entire body, there seemed to be green flames burning. The flames seeped out from under the scales and fell to the ground. In an instant they formed a cluster of emerald green crystals. As it slowly moved forward, the crystals flowed into a forest. Every step it took was enough to shake the entire valley. The way it strode forward with its head held high made people feel small and insignificant, as if it had the bearing of a king. Its huge head looked down at everyone condescendingly. Its black eyeballs were like solidified lava balls, looking at everyone in the valley with a look of contempt. But its gaze was mainly on Brando. Brando felt his scalp tingle. There was no doubt that this was the king of the Bronze Tribe, the Godslayer, the verdant dragon Nidhogg. Nidhogg's black eyeballs seemed to contain a green flame, but there was no gentleness in them. When it saw Brando, the look in its eyes became colder. Brando lowered his head and saw the thing under Nidhogg's claws. It was a crystal prism, and in the prism, the female mercenary captain was sealed motionlessly. Brando turned his head back angrily. He did not need to think to know whose masterpiece this was. Romaine smiled at him sweetly, as if she was very satisfied with this prank. At this time, Medisha's telepathic message came immediately. "My lord, we will stop the Twilight Dragon. You go and save Miss Yuta. The portal in the middle of the valley is shrinking. You must hurry." Brando looked in that direction and nodded silently. He understood that this was the only way. Brando stood up, and the verdant dragon Nidhogg immediately roared in his direction. At that moment it was as if the whole valley shook. But Brando only glanced at it and disappeared from its sight in a flash. When he reappeared, he was already above the dragon's head. Brando pulled out the shallow sea holy sword Cinna in midair. With Odorfice in one hand and Cinna in the other, he jumped down heavily and stabbed the two swords into Nidhogg's head. Nidhogg let out a blood-curdling scream. Green flames immediately spread out from the wound and scattered in all directions. Nidhogg's sword had left a deep wound on the dragon's forehead, and it was so deep that the dragon's bones could be seen. But the verdant dragon immediately lowered its head, turned around, and swept its huge tail towards Brando like a mountain. The huge shadow rushed towards him. Brando put away the holy sword Odorfice with one hand, and with the other hand holding Cinna, he directly launched the glacier attack. A glacier dozens of miles long spread forward. The icy wind whistled, and the 10,000-year-old ice almost froze half of Nidhogg's tail and the back half of his body into an ice sculpture. And the remaining power of Cinna continued to move forward, turning a piece of the emerald forest into ice shards in the distance. As far as the eye could see, it was as if an endless glacier had appeared in the darkness. The freezing effect caused the verdant dragon to pause for a moment. Brando finally found an opportunity to flip down under the dragon's claws and grab the crystal that sealed Yuta. With a spatial teleportation, he teleported far away in the direction of the Shire. But in the next moment, the glacier suddenly cracked, and Nidhogg took the opportunity to claw down at Brando. Although Nidhogg looked huge and clumsy, the claw was so fast that it almost left a shadow. Brando had to rely on his ability to control time to barely see the attack's trajectory. He lunged forward to avoid the fatal blow. But what made him a little creeped out was that this damn thing did not even use the elemental laws, and it actually tore a crack in space with brute force. He clearly saw the black spots brought by the claw, which were the signs of space breaking. What kind of monster is this? After his successful attack, Brando immediately took a step back, and Haurangaya appeared in his right hand. He reversed the tip of the sword and stabbed it into the ground, and the ability of the Frost Earth Guard instantly burst out. Combined with the glacier created by the shallow sea sword, the stable power of the earth surged out from the ground, and two strong walls entwined with different law networks rose from the ground, separating him from Nidhogg. At this moment the Shire's voice sounded. "My lord, Miss Yuta is safe, retreat quickly."